Herzlichen Dank, lieber Ulrich Schlie, dear Mr. State Secretary Speich, esteemed guests, dear colleagues, dear friends of the Center for Advanced Security, Strategic and Integration Studies, Bonn, and the Center for Geopolitics at Cambridge University. I am tremendously pleased to welcome you to today's event and to have the opportunity of saying a few introductory words. The summer of 2021 marks the 75th anniversary of the founding of the federal state of North Rhine-Westphalia. Without the influence of the British, this political construct composed of the historically and culturally rather distinct regions of the Rhineland and Westphalia would in all likelihood never have come into existence at all. When a new federal state was created on August 23rd, 1946, it was at the behest of the British military government in Germany, whose decision to bring about this political and geographical marriage was motivated by organizational and strategic considerations. The emergence and development of North Rhine-Westphalia are thus inextricably linked with the United Kingdom. And it is intriguing to look at these connections while bearing in mind future perspectives and challenges as well. Considering the belligerent and bloody history that preceded the creation of North Rhine-Westphalia, few would have predicted that the ties between Germany's most populous state and Britain would go on to develop as positively as they have from today's vantage point, that they would give rise to a mutual appreciation, a close exchange, and numerous friendships on a political, economic, and private level. Here in Bonn, these ties are most notably cultivated through the twinning with Oxford, a bond that has also been maintained for over 70 years. And at the University of Bonn, the relationship between the United Kingdom is advanced through long-standing partnerships with the universities of Oxford and St. Andrews, and through CASSIS, not least with the University of Cambridge. Given this special connection, the United Kingdom's increasing alienation from the EU was observed with great regret, especially by many here in North Rhine-Westphalia. Such sentiments have not least been driven by concerns that the altered political framework will be increasingly accompanied by obstacles to exchange and collaboration. This makes it all the more important to use this anniversary as an opportunity to reaffirm our mutual history and the conviction we continue to share. There is no doubt that despite Brexit, the conditions for North Rhine-Westphalia and the EU as a whole to remain good neighbors with the United Kingdom as part of a friendly and intensively cultivated relationship continue to remain good. Within this context, it is certainly possible to build upon the existing NATO and G7 framework, but it remains to be discussed whether and what additional forums are needed to explore mutual interests and represent them as efficiently as possible on the international stage, and moreover, what the concrete components of a common strategic foreign policy might look like. I am looking forward to these ideas and input of the speakers and all contributors on these and other matters. And I am tremendously delighted that we can analyze the intriguing and urgent questions of this forum with such an exceptional group of participants. Thank you all very much for your participation and in advance for your contributions. I would also like to express a special thanks to the organizers of this event, the Center for Advanced Security, Strategic and Integration Studies at the University of Bonn and the Center for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. We owe the initiation and execution of this event to them, and I am confident that additional existing formats will emerge from this cooperation in future. Finally, I would like to thank the State Chancellery of North Rhine-Westphalia, whose generous support has made this event possible. All that remains for me is to wish all of you an insightful afternoon. Thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks, Dean Cronenberg, for your kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. Auch meinerseits ein herzliches Willkommen zu unserer Veranstaltung The United Kingdom, Europe and North Rhine-Westphalia Towards a New Partnership in an Uncertain World. Diese Veranstaltung ist eine Premiere und sie ist ein Gemeinschaftsprodukt, das aus der Zusammenarbeit zwischen dem Center for Geopolitics der Universität Cambridge und der Henry Kissinger Professur für Sicherheits- und Strategieforschung der Universität Bonn unter dem Dach von CASSIS entstanden ist. Wir wollen uns heute Nachmittag mit Fragen der internationalen Ordnung und mit den neuen Dimensionen von Sicherheit und ihren Auswirkungen auf staatliches Handeln beschäftigen. Ich freue mich, dass wir dafür eine Reihe von renommierten Experten und politischen Praktikern gewinnen konnten. Dass die Veranstaltung in dieser Zusammensetzung und mit diesem thematischen Schwerpunkt stattfinden kann, verdankt sie der internationalen Strategie und der Kooperation unseres Bundeslandes Nordrhein-Westfalen. Zwischen Nordrhein-Westfalen und dem Vereinigten Königreich bestehen seit 75 Jahren enge freundschaftliche Beziehungen. Zugespitzt könnte man sagen, dass es Nordrhein-Westfalen in der heutigen Form ohne das Vereinigte Königreich und den britischen Einfluss nach 1945 auf Politik und Verwaltung an Rhein und Ruhr gar nicht geben würde. In diesem Jahr begeht unser Bundesland sein 75-jähriges Bestehen, sein 75-jähriges Jubiläum der Freundschaft zwischen Nordrhein-Westfalen und dem Vereinigten Königreich. Diese Veranstaltung fügt sich in eine Reihe von ganz verschiedenen Veranstaltungen ein, die sich unter dem jeweiligen Blickwinkel mit den Beziehungen zwischen Nordrhein-Westfalen und dem Vereinigten Königreich beschäftigen. Staatssekretär Marc Speich wird dazu später sprechen. Sicherheit, also Fragen, die mit den zunehmenden sicherheitspolitischen Gefährdungen, den verschwimmenden Grenzen zwischen staatlichen und privaten Akteuren und immer neuen technologischen Möglichkeiten zu tun haben, sind Fragen, zu denen im Vereinigten Königreich seit jeher eine besondere Kompetenz vorhanden ist. Das erklärt sich aus der Geschichte, aus den Prägungen durch das Commonwealth und dem Anspruch einer globalen Macht. Wir wollen gemeinsam diese Kenntnisse nutzen, uns mit künftigen Krisen und Einsatzszenarien beschäftigen, uns mit den militärischen genauso wie mit den nicht-militärischen Bedrohungen auseinandersetzen. Zur Sicherheit gehört heute insbesondere auch die Fähigkeit und die Bereitschaft, Entwicklungen in der Energiewirtschaft und der Telekommunikation, den Schutz kritischer Infrastruktur, Big Data und künstliche Intelligenz, Automatisierung und Quantum Computing mitzudenken und mit den klassischen sicherheitspolitischen Fragestellungen zu verbinden. Genau das ist eine der Aufgaben, der wir hier an CASSIS nachgehen. Nicht alle Fragen werden wir heute erschöpfend besprechen können. Viel lieber auch hätten wir uns bei leichten Nieselregen in Bonn am Rhein persönlich getroffen, wenn ich aus dem Fenster blicke, um uns auszutauschen. Wir werden das aber nachholen und dann, verspreche ich es, bei Sonnenschein am Rhein. Wir hoffen sehr, dass wir die Fragen, die wir heute gemeinsam vertiefen wollen, demnächst auch in ein gemeinsames Arbeitsprogramm und eben in weitere persönliche Begegnungen aufgreifen können. Mein Dank geht dabei heute an alle, die diese Veranstaltung möglich gemacht haben. Fenja Viluda und das Team der Henry Kissinger Professur, das Team des Centers for Geopolitics, der Philosophischen Fakultät der Universität Bonn und insbesondere ihren Dekan Volker Cronenberg, der gerade zu uns gesprochen hat, aber vor allem der Landesregierung in Düsseldorf und dem Team der Staatskanzlei, die uns unterstützt haben. Ich freue mich, dass wir auch diese Veranstaltung gemeinsam mit der Universität Cambridge und dem Center for Geopolitics durchführen können und übergebe an Professor Brandon Sims, Professor of History and International Relations and Director of the Center for Geopolitics of the University of Cambridge, einem alten Freund und Partner, das Wort. Brandon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Brendan Sims, and I'm the director of the Centre for Geopolitics in Cambridge, as you've just heard. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this event, held jointly with the Centre for Advanced Security, Strategic and Integration Studies at the University of Bonn. I'm particularly pleased to be opening proceedings together with my old friend Ulrich Schlie. It is also a nostalgic moment for me because I spent 3 happy years in the 1970s living in Bonn as a schoolboy. Our topic today is the United Kingdom, Europe, and North Rhine-Westphalia towards a new partnership in an uncertain world. As an historian, I note that there's a special relationship between Britain and North Rhine-Westphalia, for better and for worse. On the negative side, most of its major cities were destroyed by the RAF in the Second World War. More positively, as Volker Cronenberg has just said, the United Kingdom, the occupying power, founded North Rhine-Westphalia in 1946 in Operation Marriage by merging part of the old Prussian Rhine province with the equally defunct Prussian province of Westphalia. The opening ceremony was dominated by a huge Union Jack between 2 small Länder flags. The 70th anniversary in 2016, which took place 2 months after Brexit, was marked by the Westdeutscher Rundfunk with a program entitled, quote, Wie die Briten NRW erfunden haben. And of course, over the following decades, after 1946, the UK helped to protect North Rhine-Westphalia through NATO. Now, surely times have changed since then. Britain and Germany have evolved, but some things, I think, remain the same. Europe, the European Union, is Britain's most important neighbour. The United Kingdom is also the European Union's most important neighbour, far more significant than Turkey or even Russia. So the big question we have before us today is to look not merely at what impact Brexit has on the mutual relationship, but also the broader issue of how the United Kingdom can be stitched back into the political management of the continent. So it's in that spirit that I now look forward to hearing what our speakers have to say. Thank you for your attention.
Brandon, many thanks for your introduction and partnership. Und als nächstes wird Staatssekretär Dr. Marc Speich zu uns sprechen. Staatssekretär Speich ist seit September Staatssekretär für Bundes- und Europaangelegenheiten sowie Internationales des Landes Nordrhein-Westfalen und er ist ein Alumni der Universität Bonn, wo er promoviert wurde. Herr Staatssekretär Speich, wir freuen uns besonders, dass diese Veranstaltung in Zusammenarbeit mit Ihrer Staatskanzlei zustande gekommen ist. Sie haben das Wort. Vielen Dank.
Vielen Dank. Spektabilis, lieber Herr Professor Cronenberg, lieber Herr Professor Schlie, lieber Herr Professor Kühnhardt, sehr geehrter Professor Sims, meine sehr verehrten Gäste. This is actually a very special occasion for me, an event organized by both of my alma maters, it is really a rare privilege and a great honor, which is even gold-plated by the fact that so many eminent and outstanding personalities will shape it, including the former master of my college, Sir Richard Dearlove. Though I have to indicate towards Brendan Sims, Peterhouse is also a great and very special place. As requested, I will now turn to German. Und ich darf gleich sagen, dass der Titel der Veranstaltung, The United Kingdom, Europe and North Rhine-Westphalia towards a new partnership in an uncertain world, etwas von einem Selbstbewusstsein atmet, was wir auf Bundesländerebene ansonsten nur unseren bavarischen Freunden zutrauen. Mir gefällt das aber, dass wir auch Nordrhein-Westfalen einmal auf diese Ebene heben, denn wenn wir uns auf die puren Fakten und Zahlen konzentrieren, wir durchaus Grund haben, uns manchmal etwas selbstbewusster gegenüber unseren Freunden aus Bayern abzuheben. Ich will das sozusagen für alle, die damit vertraut sind, nicht zu detailliert ausführen, aber Nordrhein-Westfalen ist eben, wenn es ein eigenständiges Land wäre, wäre es eine der 20 größten Volkswirtschaften der Welt und die Nummer 7 in Europa. Wir stellen dieses Licht manchmal unter den Scheffel. Hier in diesem Titel tun wir es nicht und dafür bin ich dankbar. Jahrzehntelang hat sich das Vereinigte Königreich als eine Brücke verstanden zwischen Europa und den USA. Aufbauend auf einem Begriff, den Sie alle kennen, der Special Relationship. Ein Begriff, den vermutlich Winston Churchill unmittelbar nach dem Zweiten Weltkrieg erstmals ausgerufen hat, 1946. Aber es ist eine Idee, die im Grunde von jedem folgenden britischen Premierminister wieder aufgenommen worden ist. Ich selbst durfte mich auch einmal etwas intensiver wissenschaftlich damit befassen in meiner Masterarbeit in Cambridge, nämlich mit der Frage, wie Harold Macmillan damals als Premierminister die besonderen Nuklearbeziehungen zu den USA nutzen wollte, um damit den Eintritt in die Europäische Wirtschaftsgemeinschaft zu ermöglichen. Es gab eine Episode, wo er sogar Charles de Gaulle diese Informationen angeboten haben will, bei einem gemeinsamen Spaziergang in Rambouillet. Macmillan glaubte, dass er ein exzellentes Französisch spricht. Er sprach auch ein gutes Französisch, aber es war anscheinend nicht ausreichend, um diesen Sachverhalt de Gaulle wirklich zu vermitteln, denn es findet sich in den Erinnerungen bei Macmillan, aber in keiner Weise bei de Gaulle oder in den französischen Aufzeichnungen. Was vielleicht auch erklärt, warum die Beziehungen zwischen den USA und Großbritannien so eng sind, weil es nämlich eine gemeinsame Sprache ist, bei der diese Art von Missverständnissen ausgeschlossen ist. Der Austritt des Vereinigten Königreichs aus der Europäischen Union stellt die Einflussnahme des Landes in und auf Europa, das ist völlig klar, vor ganz neue Herausforderungen. Dass dieser Einschnitt Auswirkungen auf die gemeinsame Außen- und Sicherheitspolitik, aber auch auf das transatlantische Verhältnis haben wird, ist bereits jetzt erkennbar und spürbar. Die transatlantische Allianz, das ist im Grunde eine Binsenweisheit, stützt sich auf gemeinsame Werte, auf politische, auf ökonomische und auf kulturelle Interdependenzen und auf institutionelle Bindungen, die über Jahrzehnte gewachsen sind. Der G7-Gipfel in der vergangenen Woche hat das noch einmal aus meiner Sicht sehr deutlich gemacht. Dass diese Werte auch nach mehreren Jahren politischer Turbulenzen, in denen sich die Zusammenarbeit nicht immer einfach gestaltet hat, to put it mildly, weiter Bestand haben, ist ein starkes Zeichen der Robustheit der gemeinsamen Beziehung. Das liegt auch nicht zuletzt daran, dass die transatlantischen Beziehungen über Jahrzehnte und insbesondere während des Ost-West-Konflikts für die Verteidigung der gemeinsamen Ordnungs- und Freiheitsvorstellungen gestanden haben. Das Vereinigte Königreich hat hierbei in der Tat sehr oft die Rolle eines Brückenkopfs eingenommen, aufgrund der historischen, der sprachlichen und der kulturellen Nähe zu den USA. Doch dieser Brückenkopf scheint aus meiner Sicht Risse zu bekommen. Denn der im Frühjahr von der britischen Regierung vorgenommene Review zur Außen- und Sicherheitspolitik lässt einen Partner fast gänzlich unerwähnt, die EU. Ein Global Britain, das derzeit gern zitiert und nach vorne gestellt wird, um die neue Rolle des Vereinigten Königreichs in der Welt zu definieren, kann unter solchen Umständen aber aus meiner Sicht nur schwer erfolgreich sein. Das Vereinigte Königreich muss seine Hand bei Fragen der Sicherheits- und Verteidigungspolitik unweigerlich in Richtung der EU ausstrecken, ganz besonders dann, wenn die eigenen Beziehungen zu den USA Früchte tragen sollen. Denn das Vereinigte Königreich ist nicht nur für Europa ein Brückenkopf in die USA, es ist gleichzeitig auch ein Brückenkopf für die USA in Richtung Europa. Weshalb eigentlich alle amerikanischen Präsidenten vor Trump Befürworter der europäischen Integration und einer stärkeren Einbindung Großbritanniens in die Strukturen der Europäischen Union waren. Löst das Vereinigte Königreich seinen Blick zu stark von der Europäischen Union, droht aus meiner Sicht auch seine Bedeutung für die USA zu schwinden. Die Special Relationship, die Churchill einst mit den USA ausrief und von der der heutige Premierminister Boris Johnson beim G7-Gipfel kürzlich eher vorsichtig Abstand nahm, ist daher vielleicht noch nicht ganz fehl am Platze. Nämlich dann, wenn man die Special Relationship nicht auf die Beziehungen zu den USA, sondern auf die Beziehungen zur EU münzt. Damit die transatlantischen Beziehungen für alle Seiten auch weiterhin den Erfolg bringen, den sie in den vergangenen Jahrzehnten gehabt haben, ist aus meiner Sicht deshalb eine enge Zusammenarbeit notwendig, die keinen der Partner ausschließt. Der Ausgang der US-Präsidentschaftswahlen im vergangenen Jahr bietet aus meiner Sicht auch gute Voraussetzungen, um die transatlantischen Beziehungen zu stärken. Auch das, glaube ich, ist das ganz klare Signal, das von Joe Biden und seiner Administration ausgeht. The US is back, das war auch sozusagen die ausgestreckte Hand bei dem Münchner Gipfel der Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz. Von deutscher Seite emotional vielleicht etwas zurückhaltend beantwortet worden. Dazu müssen aber nicht nur bestehende Formen des Austauschs genutzt werden und vielleicht auch noch stärker genutzt werden und vielleicht auch neue Foren des Austauschs geschaffen werden. Dazu müssen die EU und Großbritannien zumindest in den Fragen, die sie gemeinsam betreffen, an einem Strang ziehen. Denn mit Blick auf die Herausforderungen im Indo-Pazifik wird sich, und das ist jetzt schon völlig klar, der US-amerikanische Fokus neu justieren. Er hat sich im Grunde schon neu justiert. Ein gespaltenes Verhältnis diesseits des Atlantischen Ozeans würde die transatlantischen Beziehungen eher weiter verkomplizieren. Der Austritt des Vereinigten Königreichs aus der EU ist mit dem Ausscheiden aus den gemeinsamen Strukturen der Außen- und Sicherheitspolitik verbunden. Die EU, das betrifft die EU, natürlich nicht die NATO, das ist klar. Die EU hat in den jahrelangen Brexit-Verhandlungen wiederholt darauf hingewiesen, dass auch weiterhin eine enge Kooperation in diesen Bereichen wünschenswert wäre. Dahingehend hielten das Brexit-Austrittsabkommen aus dem Jahr 19 und die politische Erklärung noch fest, dass es eine, ich zitiere, ehrgeizige, enge und dauerhafte Zusammenarbeit beim auswärtigen Handeln zum Schutz vor externen Bedrohungen geben müsse. Doch als Anfang 2020 die Verhandlungen über ein Abkommen zu den künftigen Beziehungen aufgenommen wurden, war das auswärtige Handeln kein Thema an den Verhandlungstischen. Auch das Ende des Jahres, also des vergangenen Jahres, geschlossene Handels- und Kooperationsabkommen zwischen der EU und dem Vereinigten Königreich erwähnt das Thema leider mit keinem Wort. Das ist bedauerlich und aus meiner Sicht für beide Seiten bedauerlich. Die letzten Jahre haben gezeigt, dass die EU ihr außenpolitisches Gewicht stärker wahrnehmen will. Die EU nimmt es zum Teil stärker wahr, aber es ist vor allen Dingen der Wille, es stärker wahrzunehmen. Das beinhaltet die Weiterentwicklung der gemeinsamen Sicherheits- und Verteidigungspolitik. Es beinhaltet Themen wie Cybersicherheit, künstliche Intelligenz, Krisenresilienz und hybride Bedrohungen. Diese Themen zeigen zum einen die Herausforderungen, vor denen die europäische Sicherheits- und Verteidigungspolitik steht, zugleich aber auch die enormen Potenziale, die sich für eine verstärkte Zusammenarbeit mit dem Vereinigten Königreich anbieten. Wenn das Vereinigte Königreich hier keine tragende Rolle mehr spielt, ist das ein Verlust für beide Seiten. Das bedeutet im Umkehrschluss aber auch, dass sich die sicherheitspolitischen Allianzen innerhalb der EU neu ordnen müssen. Ich glaube, dass es, und das ist jetzt schon sichtbar, schwer ist, im Kreise der 27 wirkliche Einheitlichkeit zu schaffen und bin der Auffassung, dass es da in der Zukunft stärker flexible Bündnisse von Gestaltungswilligen geben wird, die in bestimmten Fragen, die sie verbinden, Handlungsfähigkeit erzeugen. Ich glaube auch, dass das erforderlich ist. Ein Impuls kann da aus der deutsch-französischen Zusammenarbeit kommen. Der Aachener Vertrag sieht die Zusammenarbeit in Sicherheits- und Verteidigungsfragen ausdrücklich vor, aber eben nicht exklusiv deutsch-französisch, sondern immer offen für andere Optionen. Aber ich glaube auch nicht, dass es zwangsläufig auf diese deutsch-französischen Impulse ankommt, sondern dass man hier flexibler vorgehen muss. Wir brauchen diese flexiblen Bündnisse, Gestaltungswilligen. Ich glaube auch nicht an einen europäischen Sicherheitsrat, der wieder eine starre Struktur ist, in die man Großbritannien einzubinden versuchte, sondern ich glaube, es sind gerade diese flexiblen Formen erforderlich, wenn man wirklich weiterhin auch gemeinsam an einem Strang ziehen will. Wichtige Schritte wurden in der jüngsten Vergangenheit schon gemacht. Ende 2020 haben sich die europäischen Akteure auf einen europäischen Verteidigungsfonds verständigt, bislang mit 8 Milliarden ausgestattet. Und ich glaube, es sind diese gemeinsamen Verteidigungsanstrengungen, die erforderlich sind, um aus dem riesigen Verteidigungsbudget der europäischen Staaten, 240 Milliarden Euro, deutlich größer eben als das, ich sage mal, politischer Konkurrenten, aber vielleicht weniger schlagfähig organisiert, wirkliche Handlungsfähigkeit zu erzeugen. Besonders zu begrüßen ist bei einem solchen Fonds der deutliche Fokus auf Forschungsausgaben. Damit stellt sich die EU nicht nur langfristig für die vielfältigen Herausforderungen auf, sondern kann gleichzeitig ihr Potenzial als Innovationsmotor unter Beweis stellen. Die Europäische Friedensfazilität ist ein weiteres Finanzierungsinstrument, das die europäische Sicherheitspolitik sinnvoll erweitern wird. Ausgestattet mit rund 5 Milliarden Euro sollen EU-Operationen und Missionen im Ausland finanziell stärker unterstützt werden. Und gleichzeitig wird auch der geografische Interventionsbereich erweitert, sodass künftig finanzielle Unterstützungsmaßnahmen der EU weltweit greifen können. Auch die 2017 etablierte ständige strukturierte Zusammenarbeit, also PESCO, wie die meisten wissen, hat während der deutschen Ratspräsidentschaft im vergangenen Jahr Fortschritte machen können. Nunmehr können auch Drittstaaten an Verteidigungsprojekten der Europäischen Union teilhaben. Das eröffnet zum einen die Tür für eine verstärkte EU-NATO-Zusammenarbeit, zum anderen würde es langfristig aber auch dem Vereinigten Königreich die Möglichkeit geben, an ausgewählten Projekten teilzunehmen. Also hier ist ausdrücklich die Flexibilität drin, die erforderlich ist, um das Vereinigte Königreich weiter einzubinden, denn es ist jetzt ja erkennbar, dass es in eine permanente Struktur nicht eingebunden werden will. Der Drittstaatenbeschluss im Rahmen der PESCO unterstreicht auch eine weitere wichtige Dimension der europäischen Sicherheits- und Verteidigungspolitik, die Flexibilität. Das ist das, was ich gerade sagte, um die in einer immer stärker vernetzten Welt aufkommenden Herausforderungen zu meistern, ist es unabdinglich, dynamisch reagieren zu können. Und deswegen sind nur flexible Formen der Zusammenarbeit ein Schlüssel zum Erfolg bei solchen Herausforderungen. So wichtig die sicherheitspolitischen Reformen innerhalb der EU selbst sind, so klar muss auch sein, dass trotzdem Wege und Möglichkeiten gefunden werden müssen, um das Vereinigte Königreich enger anzubinden. Auch wenn London noch die Gespräche über die Zusammenarbeit in der Sicherheitspolitik ablehnt, sollte die EU aus meiner Sicht die Tür für den gemeinsamen Dialog immer weit offen stehen lassen. Es ist in unserem eigenen Interesse, diese Tür immer geöffnet zu halten. Unsere geografische Nähe, unsere wirtschaftliche Verbundenheit, ja auch die gemeinsamen Werte und nicht zuletzt die vielen globalen Herausforderungen, vor denen wir gemeinsam stehen, machen deutlich, das Vereinigte Königreich und die EU sind immer noch strategische Partner. Die strategische Verbundenheit sollte das Vereinigte Königreich einmal mehr als Anlass nehmen, seine Funktion als Brückenkopf zwischen der Welt dies und der Welt jenseits des Atlantiks wieder verstärkt aufzunehmen. Denn dass die EU und das Vereinigte Königreich gleichzeitig auch bei vielen außenpolitischen Themen, etwa mit Blick auf China, Russland, den Klimawandel, eine äußerst ähnliche Linie vertreten, verdeutlicht diese Verbundenheit einmal mehr. Obwohl ich auch nicht verleugnen will, dass es hier Unterschiede in den Nuancen gibt. Eine offene Tür muss aber auch durchschritten werden. Bleibt das Vereinigte Königreich bei der europäischen Sicherheitspolitik weiterhin außen vor, müssen andere Formate und Institutionen stärker für die Zusammenarbeit in den Blick genommen werden. Dann werden NATO, das ist ohnehin sozusagen die zentrale Institution für die sicherheitspolitische Zusammenarbeit, G7 oder auch Sonderformate wie E3 eine noch wichtigere Rolle spielen. Aber wie ich schon sagte, die müssen flexibel angelegt sein. Die dürfen nicht starr strukturiert sein. Dabei können auch bilaterale Formate stärker in den Fokus rücken. Schon 2018 haben die Außenminister Deutschlands und des Vereinigten Königreichs vereinbart, einen regelmäßigen Austausch über die gemeinsamen außenpolitischen Angelegenheiten abzuhalten. In der Aussicht steht zudem eine bilaterale Absichtserklärung zu außen- und sicherheitspolitischen Fragen. Ich glaube, die ist, wenn ich es richtig verstehe, gerade in Arbeit. Diese würde einen wichtigen Grundstein legen, um die vielfältigen Herausforderungen gemeinsam anzunehmen. Die Absichtserklärung könnte dabei trotz ihres bilateralen Charakters auch die Möglichkeit bieten, das Vereinigte Königreich wieder enger an die Sicherheits- und Verteidigungspolitik der EU heranzuführen. Es ist eine Chance, die genutzt werden sollte. Durch den Blick auf die bilateralen Beziehungen rückt auch Nordrhein-Westfalen in den Fokus. Denn in einem föderalen Staat wie der Bundesrepublik ist es geboten, dass sich auch die Bundesländer als Akteure der internationalen Politik verstehen. Erst recht, wenn sie auf eine so intensive Weise international verflechtet sind, wie das bei Nordrhein-Westfalen der Fall ist. Wir sind nicht nur was die Lage anbelangt, im Herzen Europas, das gilt für die Wirtschaft, das gilt für die Handelsbeziehungen. Wir sind ein Bundesland, das ganz zwangsläufig, aber auch ganz bewusst international denken muss. Und gerade uns in Nordrhein-Westfalen verbindet eine enge und gemeinschaftliche Beziehung mit einem internationalen Partner. Ich will das nicht wiederholen, es ist in den einführenden Bemerkungen schon betont worden. Diese Verbindung geht eben bis auf die Gründung unseres Bundeslandes zurück und währt nunmehr seit 75 Jahren und ist ein konstanter Pfeiler Nordrhein-Westfalens in der internationalen Zusammenarbeit. Die jahrzehntelange Anwesenheit britischer Truppen auf nordrhein-westfälischem Gebiet haben das Vereinigte Königreich zu einem zentralen sicherheitspolitischen Akteur in unserem Bundesland gemacht. Also wir haben die Verteidigung der Freiheit mit der britischen Rheinarmee physisch wahrgenommen. Das war nichts, was irgendwo in der Ferne war, sondern es war etwas, was physisch präsent war. Auch die Verbundenheit, die Partnerschaft, die durch die Präsenz dieser Truppen zum Ausdruck gekommen ist. Gerade deshalb hat das Thema der sicherheits- und verteidigungspolitischen Zusammenarbeit mit unseren britischen Freunden für uns eine so zentrale Bedeutung. Der Brexit hat die Beziehungen zwischen der EU und dem Vereinigten Königreich nachhaltig beeinflusst. Dass sich die Differenzen nicht von heute auf morgen werden beseitigen lassen, zeigt unter anderem die anhaltende Diskussion um die Nordirlandfrage. Spürbar dürften diese Spannungen und Differenzen auch bei der Kooperation in der Sicherheits- und Verteidigungspolitik werden. Egal ob mit Blick auf die transatlantischen Beziehungen, auf die vielen globalen Herausforderungen oder die Reformbemühungen der gemeinsamen europäischen Sicherheits- und Verteidigungspolitik, die Zusammenarbeit wird in keinem dieser Felder durch den Brexit erleichtert. Dennoch gibt es auch eine Chance für einen Neustart. Das gilt auch für Fragen der Sicherheits- und Verteidigungspolitik. Manche Aspekte liegen vielleicht auf der Hand, die stärkere Betonung des bilateralen Austauschs. Bei manchen Aspekten wird man auch Neuland betreten müssen. Etwa bei der Frage nach den institutionellen Foren für die Abstimmung mit der EU insgesamt. Und manchmal wird diese neu zu konsolidierende Partnerschaft einen vielleicht auch etwas schwierigen Verlauf nehmen, manchmal vielleicht aber auch viel besser funktionieren als zunächst befürchtet. Fest steht in jedem Falle, beide Seiten müssen viel daran setzen, ihre strategische Verbundenheit zu bewahren. Das ist kein Selbstläufer in der jetzigen Situation. Und daran wird sich auch entscheiden, ob das Vereinigte Königreich weiterhin als der viel zitierte Brückenkopf fungieren wird. Ich freue mich deshalb umso mehr, heute der Diskussion mit den wirklich sehr, sehr namhaften Expertinnen und Experten folgen zu dürfen. Insbesondere freue ich mich, dass die Expertise von dies und jenseits des Ärmelkanals an einen Tisch, in diesem Fall ist es ein digitaler Tisch, aber an einen Tisch kommt, und um über die Herausforderungen der Sicherheits- und Verteidigungspolitik im Spannungsfeld zwischen EU und dem Vereinigten Königreich zu diskutieren. Und besonders freue ich mich, ich habe das eingangs schon gesagt, dass diese von Herrn Professor Schlie geplante Veranstaltung in Kooperation mit unseren britischen Freunden und hier insbesondere mit der University of Cambridge erfolgt. Das ist auch ein schönes Sinnbild dafür, dass gerade im akademischen, im wissenschaftlichen Bereich die Zusammenarbeit ganz eng bleiben muss. Und hier sind wir natürlich in einem Feld der unmittelbaren Landeszuständigkeit. Ich habe vor wenigen Tagen die diesjährige Königswinterkonferenz besucht, die auch virtuell stattfand. Und es ist interessant, dass es im Grunde nur noch wenige Themen gibt, die wirklich bilateral diskutiert werden. Wenn man über Sicherheits- und Verteidigungspolitik spricht, spricht man über EU und vor allen Dingen über NATO. Bei anderen Fragen ist es noch komplizierter geworden, wenn man ganz ehrlich ist. Die Fragen, die wirklich bilateral eine Rolle spielen und die bei Königswinter vielleicht früher nie so eine große Rolle gespielt haben, waren plötzlich die Fragen des Wissenschafts- und Bildungsaustauschs. Hier hat es mit dem Ausscheiden aus Erasmus Plus aus meiner Sicht auch echte Fehlentscheidungen gegeben. Das ist nichts, was unmittelbar Sicherheitspolitik ist, aber es ist zentral und wichtig, um die langfristigen Bindungen zwischen zwei Ländern zu festigen. Und deswegen glaube ich, ist alles, was dieser wissenschaftlichen Verbundenheit und Zusammenarbeit dient, auch ein Beitrag zur Vertiefung der bilateralen Beziehungen. Dafür bin ich ganz besonders dankbar. Und in diesem Geiste freue ich mich auf den heutigen Austausch und danke nochmal allen, die ihn möglich gemacht haben. Vielen Dank.
Vielen Dank, lieber Herr Staatssekretär Speich, dass Sie uns so kenntnisreich und umfänglich in das Thema hineingestoßen haben. Vielen Dank auch vor allem, dass Sie die strategische Verbundenheit so herausgestellt haben. Das wird ja ein durchgängiges Thema unserer heutigen Sitzung sein. Und ich freue mich, dass wir gleich mit dem ersten Panel beginnen können. Besonders erfreut bin ich, dass wir Nora Müller gewinnen konnten, dieses Panel zu leiten und uns in dieses Panel einzuführen. Nora Müller ist die Leiterin des Hauptstadtbüros der Körber-Stiftung und sie leitet dort auch den Bereich Internationales. Sie ist seit 2007 für die Körber-Stiftung tätig. Nora, the floor is yours and it's a great pleasure to have you again on a panel of our university. Welcome.
Ulrich, thank you very much and a warm welcome to all of you. Well, I think the organizers have really given us a vast, almost unachievable and a bit daunting task for the coming 90 minutes or so towards a global security web shaping the future together. That's huge, as a former US president would have probably said on this occasion. But thankfully, State Secretary Mark Speich has given us a lot of food for thought and a lot of vantage points to start from. And thankfully, I am also joined by a stellar panel for this conversation. Let me extend a very warm welcome in alphabetical order to Ludger Kühnhardt. He's professor at the Institute for Political Science and Sociology and also director of the Center for European Integration Studies at the University of Bonn. And he will, as we discussed beforehand, he will be the quintessential continental European on this panel. Let me also extend a very warm welcome to Susan Rain. Susan Rain is a visiting professor at the Department of War Studies at King's College, and she's also an affiliated lecturer at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge. Great to have you with us, Susan. And then, of course, Peter Watkins. Peter Watkins is Associate Fellow at the International Security Program of Chatham House, and he's also a former Director General of Strategy and International Affairs at the Ministry of Defense of the United Kingdom. A warm welcome to you as well. So what's at stake? I think Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, put it quite nicely. He said that the international system is more and more fragmented, while our challenges are more and more global, and that's true. I think the point is that the dominant feature of the global order has become the new great power rivalry, especially between the US and China, but also others. And at the same time, we have lots and lots of transnational threats that know no borders, such as very recently pandemics, global health threats, disruptive technologies, climate crises, and the list goes on and on. But on the positive note of things, there are also some silver linings, one of them being that the West is back on track, or so it seems at least, and we will have the opportunity to look back and draw some conclusions maybe of the summits of last week. The news cycle has gone on already, but for starters, I still wanted to take us back to the summits last week. We had the G7 summit, the EU-US summit, the NATO summit. And I wanted to maybe start with you, Susan, if I could, and ask you what your main takeaway from these summits were. I think that China was very much the elephant in the room, and a decisive one at that. But what did you take away from those summits?
Thank you, but not thank you for making me go first. There's some really obvious sort of takeaways which are not entirely positive. For example, I was struck at the G7 and that dreadful photograph that were it not for the German contribution, it would have been a very undiverse group of people standing there, taking decisions that are ostensibly about bringing new life to the definition of the world order. And for me personally, but I think for all of us, there's something very important that we need to think about, which is how whatever takes shape next needs to be more inclusive than those photographs looked. And I know the British Prime Minister said we want to shape a more feminine world, but I think it goes much more broadly than that. So that's a kind of really obvious point, but I just thought that the optics of it, while it makes sense from our perspective, it shows, I think, how much work there is to do if we're going to create a sort of a successor to the world order that we feel has worked since the end of the Second World War. And again, I don't want to start by saying a series of negative things, but I think when Biden appeared and said America is back, everyone went, oh, thank goodness. We don't have to worry, you know, we can just essentially fall in behind the American energy and impetus, and that will enable all the things that make us comfortable to keep working. And of course, America is back, but I don't think we can take for granted that amount of American focus and energy on the things that we want it to. You know, President Biden has a series of critical issues, and one of them is China, and obviously his domestic problems, and the economy and climate are his critical issues. And then I think we're going to see a degree of America kind of maintaining engagement, but not necessarily choosing to lead. And it might be that actually President Biden is looking for ways that he can reduce the amount of effort that America needs to put in. So, for example, the discussion about Ukraine's membership of NATO, the discussion about Nord Stream are essentially concessions to just try and dampen things down.
This was once called leading from behind.
Well, I think, and so I think we need to sort of take on board that America's not going to lead everything. Mm-hmm. And then that comes to the sort of question then is who stands up and how, and that is where, you know, you would hope that the collective power of all the nations of Europe, which includes the UK as kind of global nations, can start to get the confidence to do some of those things themselves, and particularly, and we've seen all the way through the convening power of actually quite small countries, which can say, we want to take the initiative, we want to convene, we want to bring solutions. So there's a whole load of things there where I think we mustn't expect too much of Biden. We mustn't expect him to solve our problems for us. And we need to include a much more diverse group of nations than was represented in those summits, I think.
Thanks very much for this great kickoff, Susan. Peter Watkins, if I could bring you into the conversation, we just heard a semi-optimistic assessment of the summits last week, and also when it comes to the restoration of the West in inverted commas. What's your take? I mean, do we see a renaissance of the West? Do we want a renaissance of the West, or should we aim at something much more inclusive than the concept of the West?
Well, I think talking about a renaissance of the West is a bit premature, but I think we're no longer in that state of Westlessness that was described at the Munich Security Conference at the beginning of last year. It is worth remembering, we have been through a probably uniquely turbulent period when the leader of the West has basically turned upon it in the form of Trump and what he said. So, that's a very difficult situation to be in. And we're now in a much better place. And, the fact that of course, there were issues at the summit and it wasn't all sweetness and light. But compared with some recent G7 summits, it was pretty constructive. So too early to talk about Renaissance, but I think the West is now looking much more united than it was a year ago. The key question, of course, is, what does it do with that new unity? And I don't think there's a huge amount of time. I mean, there are some very pressing issues. You said that China was the elephant in the room. I think that's almost, that's true. I mean, that almost implies that, China was not there in a way, but everybody knew it was there. I mean, China was the underlying theme in many respects. So there's the pressure from China. There are still issues with Russia, the recent incidents involving Belarus and so on. There are the underlying issues around the pandemic, around climate, and so on. So there's a lot to be done in a short time. And I think the West is better placed now that it's stopped squabbling amongst itself quite so much to get on with those things. But I do very much agree with Suzanne that there is a real risk of people breathing a sigh of relief and, leaning back on America. America cannot do everything. America is being challenged in a way that it hasn't been for decades. And we don't know who is going to win the midterm elections in November 2022. We could see the Republicans regain control of Congress. We don't know who's going to win in 2024. So we do, not because we're anti-American, I mean, I'm certainly not anti-American, and the UK is not anti-American, but we do need to become a little less reliant on America and do more stuff for ourselves. And we can perhaps talk about how we do that.
That would be indeed a very good idea. And if I could dig a little deeper on one argument you put forward, namely that we should use the fairly short amount of sort of 4 or maximum 8 years of a Biden administration to get some things done, and possibly also to make the international order shock-proof, because we don't know what will come out of Washington after the Biden administration. So if you could maybe present a bit of a to-do list for these years to come, what would be, maybe not an entire to-do list, but what would be the top 3 items on that list?
Well, I think the first one is around technology. These are not necessarily order of precedence, as it were, but we are being challenged technologically, the West is, in a way that it's never been before. And we need to pull together to basically protect the edge that we have, but also to invest in new technologies so that we do not become dependent in the way that we found that we were with 5G technology. And the huge debates that that's caused in all of our countries, and we don't really want to be in that situation again. The second one, I would say, is to do with China. And I don't think the competition with China is a conventional sort of military one, like, the Cold War and all that. I mean, that's not a particularly helpful parallel. But there is a competition going on for the allegiance of middle and smaller powers around the world. And one mechanism that China developed to try and get people on its side was, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, which in some ways has not been as stupendously successful as China might have hoped. So I would say the second priority is putting together that alternative investment entity that was talked about at the G7, and to get it moving, and get it moving quickly. And in particular, I would say in Africa, where the West is losing its position really quite rapidly in Africa. And then I think the third one, which is the most difficult, but you've got to start somewhere, and it partly goes back to Suzanne's point about the optics, is reinforcing the multilateral order. China is very active in seeking to use the order, the UN agencies and so on, to its own advantage. It's probably overplayed its hand in the UN, from what I hear. So let's use the moment to recommit to things like the World Health Organization, the International Telecoms Union, and so on. We've got to assert, as it were, our interest and ownership in not only the sort of obvious rules that run the world, but also the less obvious rules and standards around the internet, telecommunications, and so on. So those would be my top three. And it's not just, when I say time is short, it's not just because we might have a different president in 4 years' time or 8 years' time. It's because these have all become urgent issues. Mm-hmm. You know, while we've been talking and, you know, worrying about other things, you know, other countries like China, and it's not just China, have been busy.
The world is not
waiting. We have
for
to
us,
get busy.
Yes. Absolutely. Thanks very much for this. And thanks also for the list. We will definitely come back to each one of the items on the list. But now I'd like to bring in Ludger Kühnhardt and sort of take a step back and ask you, Professor Kühnhardt, about the way Europeans at this point in time look towards the US. I mean, I think the sigh of relief that we have now a staunch Atlanticist back in the White House can be still heard all over Europe. But there's still this lingering uncertainty whether Joe Biden is the exception from the rule or Donald Trump is the exception from the rule. So that definitely puts a strain on the transatlantic relationship. How do Europeans deal with that uncertainty, and what does it also mean for the relations between the EU and the UK, and you know, our ability to address some of those issues that Peter Watkins just mentioned?
Thank you for this question, Nora. Before I get into this, I would like to add a quick word to Suzanne's remark about the family picture at the G7 summit. At least the United Kingdom has taken the lead in this regard, isn't it? I mean, you gave us 2 prime ministers, female prime ministers already in the course of recent decades. And I think the magnificent regal appearance of Her Majesty was touching and really moving for all of us, whether we were British citizens that evening or not, seeing Her Majesty after her period of mourning so much in the center of this G7 summit, not the least in conjunction with this biological, ecological premise they visited for that evening. So I think one should also keep that memory in mind. And another memory comes to my mind when it, with regard to our host here, our co-host CASSIS, hosted Henry Kissinger a few weeks ago, and Kissinger's never dying, an eternal source of wisdom, reminded us that the key question is to ask what is the real problem. We have to ask the right question first. And the right question, he reminded us these days, is to address issues which are relevant in the context of the biggest threat of all for our time, Kissinger said, and that is the current transfer or transition from a non-polar or multipolar to a multilateral world order. With eminent historians here in Cambridge and Bonn among us, we could discuss for hours the transition from the 17th to the 18th, from the 19th to the 20th, or the different experiences of the 21st century. But I must say, and in this I'm pretty pessimistic, I'm afraid, that the G7 meeting, the West is back, was the big announcement, and Nora, you asked me how I look at it, was united in failure, failed at the first occasion to address the right question Kissinger would have wanted to be addressed, namely to deal in a proper way with the with the effect of the corona pandemic. We have seen a competition over figures nobody could really understand in the end, and eventually a very poor and I would say very stingy reaction to the global challenge to provide vaccine. This is a security issue of prime order. When I have my figures correct, the overall vaccine collection the EU was able to organize with regard to several producers last year in the amount of 2.8 billion doses, 2.8 billion jabs, will cost all of us here in the EU not more than 18.5 billion euro, 80.5 billion. If the European Union would have provided for free 2 jabs of the cheapest possible or available vaccine for the whole global south, it would not have cost us more. Together, the G7 countries would not cost us more than 22 to 30 billion euro. Oxfam has talked about 11 billion necessary jabs. That comes close to my mathematics here. And I think this is a peanuts sum compared to the debt we are all paying now in our G7 countries in reaction to the socioeconomic long-term effects of Corona. And as I said, we were united, our leaders were united in failure, missing the opportunity to provide for free a Corona vaccine for the whole mankind in the global south. This would have been the best possible strategic response to the rise of China, to the semi-rise of Russia, and to all the weaning and whining among ourselves about whether the West is back or not back in Renaissance mood, or however we like to frame it.
Dr. Keynote, let me interrupt you for a moment. I think that's a super important point and bring you still back to my initial question, namely, how do we Europeans deal with this uncertainty of not knowing whether Trump is the exception from the rule or Joe Biden is the exception from the rule? Because that, you know, leaves a sense of, wow, the transatlantic relationship has become pretty unreliable. And does this mean we're pretty much back on our own?
Well, I think Trump bashing for 4 years was the cheapest currency around among us here in Europe. We should not replace it now with too much Biden euphoria. If I just run, without giving big arguments here, through a complex list of leftovers, so to say, of the Trump agenda and new items on it, I would say, well, first, the Trump legacy is not going to disappear just overnight. Second, yes, there has been progress in terms of a suspension of the duties Airbus and Boeing have imposed upon, or the EU and the US have imposed upon Airbus and Boeing. The suspension until 2026 is kind of a first step in the right direction. However, number 3, the steel and aluminium charges imposed on Europe by the Trump administration are still in place. This has always been an old transatlantic issue. If you go back to the 1980s, steel and aluminium were always on the list. This time, we are freed from having also agriculture on that same list. 4th point, WTO. The arbitration mechanism has not been reinstalled. Biden has not delivered on this, which is a key issue if we talk about rule-based multilateralism. Number 5th point, climate change. Yes, a good step forward to enter the Paris Agreement, but I'm afraid that the plan of the European Union to install a CO2 tax will produce new trouble. Also in this, let's say, climate-economic context of transatlantic relations. 6th point, good news is the installment of a trade and technology council that responds to Peter Watkins' suggestion to look at technology first, not the least in the context of artificial intelligence and all the cyber-related issues. The seventh point, and here I'll be brief and just in summary, I say, generally speaking, in terms of foreign policy issues, we have seen the return to a better exchange of ideas on China, on Russia, on even defense issues under the umbrella of NATO. That doesn't mean that structural differences, political differences and family quarrels, which we have always seen in transatlantic relations, will be completely put under the rug. But its style and substance, this return to a more, let's say, sophisticated, mature exchange of views has been, all in all, a big improvement during the first months now of the Biden administration, and also in light of Joe Biden's visit to the European Union and its leadership last week.
It certainly is. And thank you also for bringing up the issue of a transatlantic technology council. And I wanted, going back to Peter Watkins's list, I wanted to throw that ball into your court, Suzanne, and ask you what you think about this idea and what would be a good way to implement it. But before I do so, I wanted to remind all our viewers today, if you have questions, ideas, thoughts, contributions, don't be shy. Post them in the chat function. I'll be more than happy to read them out, to pass them on to our panelists and bring you all into this conversation. But Suzanne, now over to you. Is this technology council, the idea of having one, is that a good idea? What do you think about it? What do you think about it?
I think anything which is getting people together and talking about this is a good idea. So you can't say it's not a good idea. I think that I thought Peter's list was incredibly impressive, not least because I don't think you gave him any prior warning. So, so we're using it as a basis. But I think that question about how we design technology for a collective future that is one that creates an environment that is safe for our societies and does not offer a strategic advantage to an adversary is the critical one. And one of the things that I've found so interesting, especially coming from a country which is essentially as free market as you can get. So basically just allow people to experiment and see what happens. And we've found that it doesn't really work in the national interest, not necessarily. So while the Chinese were looking at their phones thinking, well, what are the critical parts of this, and what do we need to build so that we can own it? And they say, well, it's that complicated bit in the back, which is somehow the 5G network. And we had gone for a free market version of this, which had a whole load of people sitting in sort of startups inventing computer games. So we were demonstrating really that the completely free market version of this doesn't necessarily produce real sort of collective endeavor and momentum behind the difficult and boring bits. So it's been very interesting to watch in the UK how the thinking has really turned now. So, well, we need to be planful about this. We need to think in terms of industrial strategy. We need to identify what are our critical points, critical infrastructure points, critical technology points, where are we most vulnerable to threat, and particularly in the question of artificial intelligence. Obviously everybody is talking about where this is good, where this might be bad, and we're having a conversation that I think we would not have had were it not for the threat from China, which is how do we control all this energy and innovation and turn it to the goods of our security and our collective security. So it's terrific that that there exists now a number of means by which those conversations can happen, and hopefully they will then lead to a more planful more coherent response. Peter's point about the International Telecommunications Union is a fascinating one, because a few years ago, none of us really paid that any attention. And it was only when it came to a critical meeting, I think, Peter, was 2019, wasn't it? Which was about the future governance of the internet. And we suddenly realized that the Chinese almost had enough votes to win the vote and change the way that the internet would be governed. So suddenly that all really matters, and we need to be very planful. That's a sort of horrible word, but we collectively need to ensure that there are the systems that enable us to make sure we don't get ambushed because we've just taken our eye off things.
That point is duly noted, Suzanne, and I fully acknowledge the argument that we have to transatlantically work on shoring up our technological spheres, but at the same time, don't we also have to think about preventing a further bifurcation of the world in terms of technology, economy? I mean, this is certainly not in our European interest to see those, you know, poles and to see this polarization of the world. So how do we deal with that?
Well, it's a good point. I suppose that's the heart of everything, isn't it? And that is obviously why Joe Biden is so focused on working out how America is going to relate to China, because unless you can reach an accommodation, it is inevitable that you're going to have some kind of divergence of systems. I mean, it's such a huge question, it's hard to answer. I heard someone saying the other day, which I think is really important, that it is possible to be, it's important to be both in partnership and competition with China, and there will be some critical areas like the climate, like health, where we have to be partners. And I suppose an ideal outcome would be a system of governance of the internet that worked for everyone. I mean, I am a bit pessimistic about that happening, because I think, you know, we're all sort of just hoping that nobody will notice that we actually have a different view of what good would look like. There's also, there is a huge black cloud over our relations with China, which we're all, again, we're all trying to walk this tightrope between you know, needing to have our economic relations, needing to have a good relationship with China, and understanding how much of a threat it could pose. But the black cloud, which is Chinese behavior in human rights terms, both the internment, I mean, you know, in the best case scenario, it's internment of hundreds of thousands of people in Xinjiang, the treatment of the Hong Kong population. Sooner or later, those countries, the West, which approach foreign policy from a moral standpoint, are going to be confronted with a choice, and everybody is kind of hoping to have to avoid the choice, but I cannot see that we can, if we do nothing over a very long period of time, at a certain point we are conniving in what the Chinese state is doing. And I know I've not answered your question. I've taken us somewhere else, but your question was too hard. So
it was too broad, and I apologize for that. But I think in many ways, Germany is the epitome of this dilemma between, you know, its values and its deep integration into the Western system of values, and at the same time its economic interests vis-a-vis China. And that's why I would like to bring in a German speaker now into the conversation and ask you, Ludger Kühnert, Armin Laschet, the minister president of the beautiful state of North Rhine-Westphalia, and also one of the candidates to succeed Chancellor Merkel, very recently gave an interview to the Financial Times, and in that interview he said that he worries that some in the United States are trying to ignite a new Cold War with Beijing. So, you know, to be a bit provocative here, is Germany lukewarm when it comes to a transatlantic China policy, or is it just defending legitimate German and European interests to some extent?
I think you introduced me as the quintessential European here initially.
Now you're the quintessential German, sorry.
Play by this role by saying that you know, what Prime Minister Laschet has said is indeed echoes what the European Union has developed as a common strategy already 2 years ago. China is seen as a partner, as a competitor, and as a strategic and systemic rival at the same time. So neither Germany nor anybody else in the European Union is talking about a new Cold War, which would be lunatic anyway, and we would be the loser anyway, not the least because of the demographics underlying this relationship. But it is necessary to realize that when we often very rhetorically, semantically dream about multilateralism as the future of the planet, we should be honest also with ourselves and accept that we are also practicing selective multilateralism, not the least when it comes to China. If you take up Peter's very important second point, the Build Back Better World initiative, which the G7 countries agreed upon last week, B3W, the Western, if you like, response to the Belt and Road Initiative. Who should finance this in the first place? Who would be able to implement it without having the Chinese on board? After all, they are part of the Belt Road. The Belt Road works already 7 times a week. Trains connect Duisburg here in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia with Zhongshan in the center of southwestern China. And so, as I said, partner, rival, or competitor and strategic rival includes also the need to think about common initiatives to make this whole idea of B3W, or however you call it, Belt and Road, manageable and realizable. The Asian development banks have just recently provided figures. The investment need in the Asian countries across this Belt Road comes to $26 billion between now and 2030. McKinsey and the World Bank have identified annual investment and infrastructure investment in infrastructure across Africa in the amount of $50 to $90 billion or euro. Who's going to pay for this? The G7, who was so stingy already on paying the vaccine bill? No way. Activating private investment is key, of course, but doing this will only work if we stop this competition with China and try to work together where it is possible in order to bridge this huge infrastructure gap across all the elements of this B3W worlds.
I think this initiative, the Build Back Better World Partnership, won't fly simply because nobody can actually pronounce it properly. But on a serious note, you said that in principle, this is a good idea. And the EU has also come up with a connectivity strategy, I think 2 or 3 years ago, with a similar thrust, I would say, not entirely the same, but with a similar thrust. But still, I think it's a fair point to argue that the EU has awoken late to China as a security threat. Do you or as a security challenge, to put it in a more moderate form? Do you, Lutke, agree with this analysis, and where do you see Europe's China policy going from here?
Well, EU-China policy has to go Indo-Pacific, if you ask me. This is the right way forward to broaden our strategic perspective. And that also gives room for many new or old connections with our friends and partners in the United Kingdom. Because the Indo-Pacific has always been on the radar of the UK, much more than here in continental Europe, maybe with the exception of France. But I think this is a strategically central region to also strategically balance the rise of China in a way which is favorable to meet Western interest across the board. And when I say across the board, I really have a huge spectrum of aspects in mind. It begins with military activities. Fighting piracy at the Horn of Africa, by the way, has been done with the Chinese together. We should not forget about this. But forcing the Chinese to accept the freedom of navigation in the South Chinese Sea might lead to direct or indirect, even military confrontation when we take the Indo-Pacific issue seriously. But the Indo-Pacific also includes something which usually is never really on our radar. 2 years ago, the United Nations General Assembly has voted in favor of the self-determination and decolonization of the British Indian Ocean Territory, or better known as Diego Garcia. And practically all EU member states, I think Germany including, abstained from this voting and did not support the position of the United Kingdom. And I think this was just a beginning of a new era of geopolitical rivalry related to huge maritime issues. And these maritime issues are not just about tiny islands, they are about the strategic relevance of the waters around these tiny islands. And that includes another loss, I think, we have to address jointly, European Union and the United Kingdom, and that is the future of the British and French overseas territories in the South Pacific. That includes the smallest of all of them, Pitcairn, known to Her Majesty in London because of the honey Pitcairn is providing, I understand, but relevant for all of us because it is close to the internet underwater cables that connect Australia and New Zealand with America. And in this year, we will see the third election, or the third round rather, of a referendum over the independence, possible independence of the French overseas territory, Nouvelle-Calédonie, New Caledonia, also located in that part of the world. These are tiny islands, irrelevant for our regular debates, but I think they have a huge impact when it comes to the strategic presence or not, the absence of this presence of the United Kingdom and the EU together in this part of the world. It is on the French agenda. President Macron is traveling all these places from Mayotte to Wallis and Futuna and other French territories all the time. Not even the slightest information about this can be found in any German daily newspaper. This is simply not an issue here in Germany, but I think these are fractions of a very relevant strategic, let's say, reorientation of all of us towards the Indo-Pacific to counterbalance China's rise also in a strategic sense. I think we have to couple this with all the socioeconomic activities along the line of this unpronounceable B3W initiative of the G7.
Absolutely. And as we're discussing the Indo-Pacific here, questions are pouring in, and let me read out one by J.D. Bindenagel, which refers exactly to the topic we just discussed. And Peter, maybe I can throw that ball into your court. Ambassador Bindenagel writes, can the UK shape the transatlantic approach to China when the US sees China as a cooperator, competitor, and adversary, while the Europeans see China as a trading partner, economic competitor, and systemic rival? Well, that's the eternal question, right?
Well, I do wonder actually whether there's such a huge difference between them. I mean, basically, China presents us with a unique challenge in a way that the Soviet Union didn't, because it is such a deeply embedded economic partner. It is part of the international system in a way that the Soviet Union wasn't. And therefore, we are inevitably going to be in a situation where we are simultaneously competing in some areas, and rightly so, and where both parties, I'll use it in rather simplistic terms, recognize the value of that, but also competing, and competition can be quite benign as well as malign, and actually pushing back in other areas. And it is possible to do all three at once. And that's what we're going to have to do. And we might use slightly different terms to describe them. But I very much agree with Professor Kühnhardt that for Europe and the UK to do that, we have to get more involved in the Indo-Pacific, which is what the British government advocated with its so-called tilt to the Indo-Pacific in the recent review. And that word was used chosen extremely carefully, because there's a lot of etymological baggage around. You know, the word pivot, for example, is to be avoided at all costs. But tilt doesn't mean, as some people I think have interpreted it, as just militarizing this issue. Yes, there will be a military dimension, but there will also be other dimensions. And the key one for me, as I indicated earlier, is that technological cooperation, which I would expect to also encompass Japan and the Republic of Korea and Australia and India, where there is huge technological potential, well, more than potential, capacity. But I would say it goes beyond, yes, the islands are important, but they're not so important. I think what European countries should be doing is deepening their partnerships with like-minded friends and partners in the region, and particularly the countries that I've just mentioned. And there's a lot that can be done there. And it's possible that what the Chinese thought would happen, and there has been some writings by Chinese figures on this, they persuaded themselves that the US was going into inexorable decline, and gradually a sort of gap, a vacuum would open up in the Indo-Pacific, which they would fill. Well, I think we can disabuse them of that notion by working with the, if you like, the middle powers in the region to ensure that it doesn't doesn't move from being a region that's been under rather benevolent US aegis to one that's under some sort of Chinese suzerainty, like it was back in the 18th century. And that would be in Europe's interest to do that. And I do agree with Professor Kühnhardt as well that this is an area where Britain as a European country should be working closely with its other European neighbors, because we do have links in the region. We don't actually have any colonies left in that part of the world, but we do have long-standing links with Brunei and other places, and some largely forgotten about multilateral military arrangements like the Five-Power Defense Agreement arrangements. And we can build on those, and can occasionally, as we've done with the current carrier deployment, but I wouldn't always see that as a model, we can provide a hub around which other countries can join. So that deployment, for example, includes American aircraft, an American ship, but also a Dutch ship. It would have been great if it could have included a German ship as well, but it didn't. And I don't know.
Maybe it will at some point.
Perhaps a future deployment will.
But if I could ask you, Peter, to be even a bit more concrete in terms of your expectations from the European or the EU member states when it comes to engagement in the Indo-Pacific? You already said this is not one-dimensional. This should include a stronger diplomatic outreach. This should include cooperation on technology. This should also have a military dimension. But what exactly do you expect from other EU, not from other, but what do you expect from EU member states in very concrete terms? And do you see a concern that in order to deploy, you know, such means, one also needs to be a capable actor in terms of foreign and security policy, which the EU isn't always, at least at this point in time? What would your reaction to this be?
Well, I think it's just worth remembering that we're talking about the Indo-Pacific here. And so what we come up with in terms of a framework or methods of cooperation and so on should be suitable for that region. And I do think we have a habit as Europeans, and again, I include the British in this, of devising various forms of cooperation which suit us in Europe, and then trying to impose them on other parts of the world. And we should be very wary about doing that. And when it comes to the strategic military situation in the Indo-Pacific, we have to recognize, and perhaps Germans and Brits would be happier doing this than, say, our French friends, that the US is the Western country with most of the equities, or the biggest equities. And I think they're going to provide the framework. They're going to provide the military deterrence framework. And we should talk to them and to the Japanese and the Australians about how we can best contribute to that. So I wouldn't personally have great expectations from a British perspective. I think the expectations, if you're asking for expectations, you should perhaps be asking our Japanese, Australian, Indian, Korean friends, and also the other countries in the region that we sometimes forget about, but also have big interests and don't particularly want to become, you know, satrapies of China in the way that they were in the 18th century again. So, but I also think that this is a field where countries can, to a large degree, do what they feel most comfortable with. So the British and the French tend to be quite comfortable with military deployments. Other countries aren't. Other countries might choose to do other things, European countries, and that's fine. My only plea is that we should get better at coordinating what we're doing. I mean, between Britain and France now, we have 3 aircraft carriers. So why don't we and the French get together and say that we will ensure that we will always have 1 aircraft carrier in that part of the world, say 80% of the time between us. And then a broader group of European countries, including Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, etc., could say, between us, we will always have not less than 3 frigates or something like that. And then it may be activities, more industrial activities and so on, where we can work in a complementary way rather than always competing with each other. So as I said, I wouldn't try and impose expectations. I would just say, let's coordinate more and be a little bit more systematic about it.
Thank you very much. Suzanne, I saw you nodding vehemently, and I had a sense you wanted to come into the conversation on the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you. Yes, well, I always agree with everything that Peter says, so that would have been my vehement nodding. But I do. I mean, there's so many different angles to this. The first point that I would like to make, which builds on what Peter was saying, is about the importance of shared understanding. So I think one of the things that makes the Five Eyes Alliance work so well is that at the heart of it, the sort of less discussed heart of it, is that it's about sharing information. And that means that it's possible to build an alliance that is based on essentially the same picture of what the problem is. And when you have the same picture of what the problem is, you are, I think, theoretically at least, more likely to end up with sort of collective view on what the solution might be. And the challenge within the EU, I mean, we're talking about different things here and we're using these terms, but between European member states or within the EU as a body or within NATO as a body is there sufficient level of shared understanding of what the problem is, of the threat posed by China or not the threat posed by China, that you can then build a sort of a shared platform through which collective action is taken. And I think this is where it's really helpful to think of it in practical terms. What is the plumbing? You know, you can build a beautiful architecturally designed house with fantastic picture windows and everything is marvelous, but if you haven't actually worked out your plumbing and your electricity, it is uninhabitable. So for me, the really important thing about how we deal with China is to have sufficient collective understanding of what the threat looks like, what the problem looks like, that you're coming at solutions essentially from the same basis of understanding. And I think that has been a real challenge within Europe between member states for a very long time, and the sort of lack of position or synchronized position on China, on Russia is indicative of that lack of shared understanding. So Professor Schlie said at the start, he was talking about Fähigkeit und Bereitschaft, so capability and readiness. And when everybody's talking about, well, what are the capabilities that NATO needs or the EU needs, you know, you can say, well, one capability is we need a whole load of kit that enables us to do stuff. We need aircraft carriers, we need technology, but the thing that we really need is a decision-making capability, the Bereitschaft bit of it. Are we in a position to decide to do something together? And often the answer to that is actually no. At the best, what we can do is decide to take a course of action which is a compromise between different views because we do not share an understanding of the problem, not deeply. And just to observe that one of the things that makes the Five Eyes Alliance work so well is it essentially has no laws and regulations. It is a Anglo-Saxon arrangement rather than Napoleonic one. There is there is no constitution. That
makes continental Europeans nervous.
No, but that's the thing, you know. So people hold it up as being, you know, an alliance which endures, an alliance which has shared purpose, which supports each other, and that is an alliance with no framework, or the very lightest of frameworks. So I think there's some really interesting questions around actually how you build alliances based on shared understanding and trust, rather than saying let's force it through a structure.
And that brings me to a question I wanted to ask Ludger Kühnert again. Speaking of Bereitschaft, speaking of willingness and capability also on the part of the EU to play a bigger role in foreign policy. There's even talk of a geopolitical role, which is quite ambitious. Do you see beyond, you know, declarations and the formulation of ambitions, do you see real progress in terms of Weltpolitikfähigkeit, the EU as a global actor? What's your take? Because I believe that this would be a precondition for the EU to meaningfully engage also in the Indo-Pacific.
The answer is yes and no. I see some positive elements, but I am still full of skepticism also, and see a long list of to-dos, homework to be done by the European Union. On the positive side, the EU has begun what I call a didactical process of learning to speak the language of power, as Josep Borrell called it. This is a pedagogical exercise, but not irrelevant in light of the fact that 80 or 90% of all the EU countries have never ever had any exposure to strategic language and conversation at all. I see progress. CASSIS, by the way, this institute here at Bonn University, also contributes to a new strategic culture, which takes time to develop in the European Union. But for the first time in 60, 70 years, I see sincere conviction on the side of the current political leadership in the EU to take up this challenge on the pedagogical side. So this is progress. What is also progress is that with the development of a strategic compass, we are seeing the development now for the first time of a common threat perception shared by all the 27 EU member states. And here I have a question also to echo a little bit on what Peter and Suzanne said about the Five Eyes operation, which, by the way, has its roots in Bletchley Park and World War II. I'm fully aware of it. But I would like to hear from you what you think the EU could contribute to the Five Eyes informal network in the years to come. In the context of this development of a strategic compass, again, we have realized that in the European Union, we have 44, think of this, 44 civilian and military services, 44. Is it a good idea or a bad idea to develop a single one? Or should we better give up with this idea right from the beginning and resort to what State Secretary Speich initially said, resorting to flexibility and pick the most capable and those who are really ready? And here that brings me to my negative side of the equation, and Nora, of your question. When it comes to military spending, I think the EU and its member states have still a long way to go. Somebody mentioned earlier this afternoon the EU Defense Fund. It's good that we have it, but it has been curtailed. It has been reduced in the course of the spending operation, which set on track the new EU budget for the next 7 years in the summer of 2020. So it doesn't seem to be number one priority, this defense fund, which is necessary to kickstart several of the PESCO projects to which the United Kingdom is always welcome. But when you look to the German performance at all and alone, and here I think North Rhine-Westphalia could indeed play a strategic role and live up to its strength, not just as a world economic power, but also as a political power within Germany and within the next German government after this autumn. Germany's defense spending, in spite of the increase over the last 4 or 5 years or so, has gone down in terms of the overall defense spending of all the NATO partners. Germany has slipped down from position 14 to position 19 between 2015 and 2019. And when it comes to investment in equipment, new equipment, which always comes with technological innovations, Peter, Germany has completely failed to reach NATO's target of 20% of military spending on new innovative equipment, and is now among only 5 NATO members which are below this 20% target. And Germany has slipped down from position 15 to place 26 when it comes to investing in new technologically relevant equipment. And I think this is really on the downside of the analysis of where the EU and also Germany as a leading EU member state stay. And I think here is really more than room for improvement. Here is an urgent need to reprioritize our spending in the course of the next upcoming German government.
certainly an interesting point. There was a recent report that the federal armed services would be defeated by an army the size of Azerbaijan. I don't know whether this was serious, but it makes clear the urgency of the matter. Here is before I and I've taken note of your question on the 5 Eyes and collaboration with the EU, but before I ask this question, probably to you, Suzanne, I wanted to take up another comment/question asked by a participant, and it is about the role of the EU as an international actor. So here it is. Between the US and China, suppose a new structure of the rest were to emerge, including the South. If that were to happen, to what extent might Europe be challenged by tensions between internal integration on the one hand and global integration on the other hand, especially in relation to global spheres of language and culture? That's a question for you, Ludger Kühnert.
We have 2 hours for that.
It's a bit complicated, but give it a try.
The two go hand in hand. We also had huge discussions 20-25 years back when globalization began. Economic globalization, that is. And the question then, the academic debate was whether, economic globalization should be first or economic regional integration should be first. I think the answer is both have to go hand in hand. And the same is true with regard now to the strategic agenda. A global kind of awakening of Europe to live up to the international challenges is of the essence. And it does not run counter to the need to balance the global order and to find some decent form of equilibrium between the different interests of the different main players. And it's also clear to me that for Europe, the #1 partner in all of this is and will remain the United States of America. As ally, as partner, economic, technological, strategic partner, and as a reassurance agent, if you like, also in the security field. I fully echo what Peter and Suzanne have said on that matter before.
Thank you for this. And let me reiterate, Peter, you wanted to come in on this?
Yeah, this may seem an odd thing for a Brit to say, but on this issue of defence, I think perhaps you're being a bit unfair on the EU. And, the cutting of the money for the defence fund and so on. I mean, from a British perspective, at least, and this, of course, has been one of the reasons why there was some friction in the past, the primary military actor for the Euro-Atlantic area is NATO. And we shouldn't expect or want the EU to do things that NATO should be doing. And I think one of the great things that was achieved in recent years, and again, this might come oddly from a Brit, because it happened under when Federica Mogherini was the High Representative, was a much clearer understanding between NATO and the EU about their respective roles. And that actually provided the basis for something which the UK strongly supports, which is closer EU-NATO cooperation, particularly in areas where the EU has competencies in the German sense, and capabilities that NATO doesn't have. So the sort of hybrid grey zone type areas. So when it comes to military spending, I mean, I'm very interested by what Ludger said, because I didn't mention at the beginning, but I served in the British Embassy in Bonn in the 1990s. And I remember it was the ambition of the Federal Ministry of Defense in those days to reach the 20% target. So here we are 25 years later, and they haven't quite got there, but never mind. I think the increase in Germany's defense budget is nonetheless still extremely impressive. And I wouldn't be overcritical on yourselves in that respect. But just going back to the question on, Five Eyes and so on, I mean, a light, nimble arrangement can achieve a lot. but there are some things for which you need more structure. And we mustn't, the Five Eyes is not joined together by an Article 5 type arrangement, which NATO is, and that is key. You know, the Article 5 commitment and the underpinning structures give NATO something that the Five Eyes will never have. And therefore it's, I'm not sure that Suzanne wasn't trying to argue that we should all go down the Five Eyes route. Yes, the Five Eyes route is good for some things, but not for everything.
Suzanne, let me turn it over to you.
So just to be clear, I was definitely not arguing we should all do we should. I think unfortunately, because there are real strengths if it can be made to work, it is impossible to try and do with, as Luca said, 44 separate entities what it's possible to do with a small number with very strong cultural links between them and a shared, sort of a shared history there. So I think it's not possible. There is a reason why the UK argued so strongly to retain competences of security and intelligence cooperation from the EU and to keep that in nation states, and that was essentially because the more members you have, the harder it is to preserve that atmosphere or the sense of trust. And I don't want that to sound negative at all, but if you've got 27 different people in the room, you immediately reduce the level of confidentiality, and that is a difficulty. It works in the NATO context, and I think that, as Peter was saying, that's where you want to be bringing all of that together, essentially for defensive purposes. I personally don't think that there is a role for the EU in coordinating all of that. I think that member states have a number of organisations which already exist, which enable collaboration in different areas. If I might speak, I'm sure Sir Richard Dearlove will bring this up in more detail, but I was disappointed during the Brexit negotiations that areas of security became pawns in a political negotiation. And in particular, I mean, I worked for 20 years on counterterrorism, so issues like the Schengen information system are a critical part of our collective defence. That's Britain feeds into it, the EU feeds into it, and we all take out of it. And we got ourselves collectively into a situation where Brussels was threatening that the UK would no longer have direct real-time access to sensitive information, and that was traded in a political negotiation. But behind all the legalistic language, that's a political act that is in no one's interest, because what it means is it reduces the likelihood that we are going to spot people who mean us harm. And so from a practitioner, the plea is that insofar as it is possible, these issues don't become about politics. They become about collective defence, and we have a pragmatic working arrangement which enables us all to be better. In very simplistic terms, because we've ended up in a situation where the UK no longer has access to a series of a set of information which could enable people in the UK working on doing data analysis to spot things that would save the lives of people in the EU, and vice versa. So that is a terrible little microcosm of what happens when you politicize.
That's a very important point, Suzanne. And irrespective of who's to blame for the development, it's a fact. And it seems to me that this all leads to some form of bilateralization of the security relations between the United Kingdom and European member states. So do you think, is that okay? I mean, in preparation of this discussion, I found a quote, in fact, Andreas Michaelis, the German ambassador to Great Britain, and he said the UK would be an ideal partner for a deep alliance with Germany, which is certainly true. But there is always also, from a German point of view, quite a dilemma. On the one hand, deepening the ties with the United Kingdom, and at the same time, the concern not to undermine the structures of the EU in those fields. So my question to you would be, are we okay with this bilateralization, or is there still a chance to also bring in the EU at some point?
Well, I was thinking about this again, and I thought we're in danger of essentially having worse relationships between very close allies than we do with other parts of the world where that alliance isn't so clear. So I think the bilateral relations have always been there, and particularly with the reserved competencies, they've always been on a bilateral basis. So that is nothing new. You also have to remember that each of the EU member states pursues its own bilateral policies everywhere. You know, when President Macron speaks, even if he's ostensibly talking about the European Union, he's actually still talking about France. You know, and in similar ways, I mean, the leaders of the European states still consider themselves to essentially have a role in the foreign policy, the security policy of their own state. So I think, notwithstanding the desire for the collective and to support the collective, I think it's only realistic to expect that you should have relations between all states on bilateral basis as well. Sorry, I could probably say more on that, but maybe I shouldn't.
Dr. Kühnert, what's your take on that? I mean, is that enough? Are we satisfied with having a sort of a set of bilateral relationships which all work well, or should there still be a role to be played also for the EU?
Yes, I think it is not enough to resort to bilateral relations only, and it will not be possible to create a perfect world which will be without tensions on these issues. I think we have to just accommodate differences without turning them always time and again into, let's say, theological disputes over truth and what is right and what is wrong. Be pragmatic. I think this is what we have learned from the British before you left the European Union, and this is what will be essential, I think, for the European Union also to practice in the years ahead in this field. Let me give you 3 examples. One is the development of the new fighter plane, due in 2040. The first prototype shall be due in 2027 if the German parliament agrees on its financial contribution. We will see. But this is an extremely expensive 100 billion euro project, basically financed by France, Spain, and Germany. You cannot possibly think that such a huge project could be conducted just by one member state. So you need several of them, and you don't need to wait till the last and smallest and, let's say, poorest country in the EU contributes also to such an operation. But then on the other hand, you have a situation like, this is my second point, the constellation in the Baltics. Because of the security threats in the Baltic region and around the Suwalki Gap between Poland and Belarus, the Russian Federation, the US has declared interest in cooperating with PESCO on the enhancement of transportation capabilities. And I think this is also about pragmatism. This also indicates that it is not, unlike what Peter earlier has said, an either-or constellation. Take it or leave it. We have NATO, that's it. Well, below NATO and beside NATO, we have there is the urgent need to bring everybody on board when it comes to such aspects which are covered by this huge PESCO agenda. So my plea is really to remain pragmatic. Don't get too nervous if we fall back to some theological disputes time and again. I know one of the reasons for the UK to have left the European Union was to regain sovereignty also in decision making on foreign policy and security matters, while at the same time now in the EU, many, including the German foreign minister, seems to be relieved to see that there is more, let's say, leverage to increase majority decision making in the years to come as part of the upcoming reform agenda in the European Union. I think it would be quite a right step forward, even if not all policy fields would be covered immediately. This again does not look aesthetically perfect. It's not a simple either-or situation as we have it with Article 5 in NATO. It will still drive many of our British friends nuts probably when they think of possible negative implications of this. But I think it is would be an important step forward to bring cohesion to the EU as a whole and to increase this, let's say, lesson, the effect of the lesson for all of us across the continent to learn the language of power.
This is almost a perfect concluding statement for this conversation, but I see we have 2 minutes left and I have a very interesting question here on the chat. So if I could turn it over quickly to Peter and to ask him to answer this as concisely as he can. If alliances work best, asks Robert Moore, if alliances work best between countries with shared values and political cultures, as in the case of the Five Eyes Alliance, what should be done or can be done to support fledgling or at-risk democracies like Taiwan or East Timor? Interesting and important questions.
Yes, but I think actually it's there are questions that conflate two different things. I mean, yes, of course.
Maybe we can only take the Taiwan case. Maybe the East Timor part is too.
I'm not sure there is a huge difference in values, as it were, between us and Taiwan. I mean, the issue is whether European countries want to become quite so engaged in what is potentially the flashpoint in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, that goes back to what I said earlier about let's think about what those with a bigger stake in the region think first before we rush into that. As I said, I think it's two separate questions. There's a sort of theoretical question there about how alliances work, and there's a rather specific issue about that particular circumstance. Perhaps as I got the floor, I might just pick up on what Ludger was saying. I wasn't arguing for NATO in a sort of take it or leave it way. I mean, of course, there are other entities, there are other arrangements. And what we have seen over the recent years is an increase within the Euro-Atlantic area, but also elsewhere, in what we might call minilateral arrangements, whether the German framework nation concept or the British-led Joint Expeditionary Force and so on. We've also seen strengthening of bilateral arrangements. And being pragmatic, those are the areas where I would currently put my energy. The integrated review, as I think the State Secretary pointed out, was almost silent about the EU as an institutional partner for the UK in security. I mean, there are, I think, quite transient political reasons for that. But that's going to be the position for a while. In the meantime, the UK is very clear that it does want to contribute to European security. And I think the way that it can do so would be through these minilateral and bilateral arrangements. And I'm with Ambassador Michaelis on this one. I would very much like us to start with Germany.
Well, that is the perfect conclusion. Thank you very much to all of you. And without much further ado, I will hand it over to Ulrich Schlie, who's already waiting for the next panel to start. Thank you all.
Nora, many thanks for your wise leadership. Ludger Kühnhardt, Susan Rain, and Peter Watkins, many thanks for a thought-provoking and extremely rich discussion. Now we are coming to the last stage. Ich freue mich ganz besonders, dass wir dafür 3 ganz außerordentliche Zeitgenossen gewonnen haben. Wir haben uns eine Frage gestellt, die auf der Linie der vorhergehenden Diskussion liegt. Sie lautet: Are our systems and politics resilient and brave enough for what we face? Und ich könnte mir keinen besseren Moderator dafür wünschen als Nick Going. Nick Going is a kind of veteran in journalism, a former BBC anchorman, a professor of King's College, and also the founder in 2014 of a project called Thinking the Unthinkable. Nick, without further ado, the floor is yours, and I assume that you might explain what Thinking the Unthinkable is and what Thinking the Unthinkable has to do with our discussion, which will follow. I'll hand over to you. Looking forward.
Thank you very much indeed, Ulrich. Can you hear me all right from London?
We can
Good.
hear.
I can see various heads nodding. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me at what is, as usual, a challenging time. Yes, why am I here? What is Thinking the Unthinkable? Well, I started this project in 2014 because of what Putin was doing in Ukraine and what he did in Crimea. And it became clear to me as I was leaving as a main presenter at the BBC that actually after my many years with geopolitics and international affairs, that something big was happening, something different was happening. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I entitled it Thinking the Unthinkable. And it gave me something to do as well, as there was enormous change taking place. But I wasn't sure that large numbers of people, including in the political field and also elsewhere, were prepared to accept that the stability that they had by and large been accepting and assuming would always be moving in a positive direction was really unraveling. What we were uncovering was really counterintuitive, and in a short order, back in 2016, what we predicted, and I'm not sure this will work on here, but it does. This is the front cover of Chatham House, The World Today, and I'm taking a risk here, I know. This was about the difficulties leaders were having with blindfolds on, trying to make their way through the difficulties which were happening at that time. And back in the beginning of June 2016, 23 days before the Brexit vote, we predicted that Brexit would happen, that Trump would be nominated, that Trump would be elected, and there were many other things, unthinkables at that time. And as we now know, David Cameron admitted that he failed abysmally to understand as Prime Minister the forces which were at work, which led to the vote for Brexit. I don't have to tell you what has been happening since, but obviously what has happened, particularly with COVID, has underscored that no one really believed it would happen. Even though, and dare I say, Peter, you and I are talking again, first time we've seen each other for what, 5 days, but we were having a conversation about this very issue, about what happened with rehearsals and exercising for a flu pandemic in the United Kingdom back in, I think it was 2016, when no one really wanted to believe something like that could happen. And look where we've been in the last 15 or 16 months. And look where we're going in the climate emergency as well. You might say it's not unthinkable. You're probably right, but it's easy to adapt Helmut Kahn's title from the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is about really thinking the unpalatable. And that's why I think Ulrich has invited me here. And I'm delighted that Roland Koch has joined as well, because Roland, you and I were actually last sharing a platform together at Aberdeen University with Brendan. And you remember that I was talking about thinking the unthinkable, but that is pre-COVID days. And not that we were talking definitely about COVID, but I was predicting that there would be serious difficulties for the political class and the corporate class to grip the enormity of shocks which were likely to happen, and shocks which were not even on their risk radar. And here we are today, and we can have a discussion about that in a moment. But we are talking about, are our systems and politics resilient? And I would like to add in here, visionary and brave enough for what we face. And that might have been seen as something which was for another day if we were talking about this 2 years ago. But here we are, struggling still with COVID and the uncertainties, but with much worse potentially to come. As Bill Gates says, we've got a vaccination for COVID. We haven't got a vaccination for the climate emergency. So that in short order is where I think Ulrich would like to take us in the next 50 minutes to try and identify whether the systems are resilient and visionary enough, maybe maverick enough, to really grip the enormity of what is happening at the moment. I'd be saying that kind of thing anyway, but let me just take 2 minutes to underscore really where we are going, because I have in front of me the communiques from the G7 from literally just over a week ago. And on climate and environment, the G7 communique says very, very clearly, we're talking about an unprecedented, interdependent crises of climate change and biodiversity loss, which is posing, quote, an existential threat to people, prosperity, security, and nature. And real worries that we won't even be able to remain within the 1.5 degrees, which is so necessary to keep global warming under some kind of control. The G7 leaders talked about it being barely within reach. And even more remarkable was what happened at NATO 2 days later on Monday. And I'm quoting here from paragraph 58. We're talking about climate change being now one of the defining challenges of our times. That would not have even been mentioned in the communique a year or two earlier. Climate change putting our resilience and civil preparedness to the test, increasing our awareness of adaptation, mitigation, and outreach efforts. In other words, we're still in uncharted territory. History is about uncharted issues, but probably more existential. And as David Attenborough would tell you, we're facing a massive existential threat. Now, this is not Gowing. This is really me trying to bring together the lines of and the direction of travel in so many areas, which we want to discuss for the next 50 minutes. And I'm hoping Sir Richard and also Roland Koch can help push us in that direction with your confidence or lack of confidence. Sadly, I haven't been able to talk to either of you in advance, but I do hope that all of you, wherever you are, can use the chat line to send your contributions as well. Don't make them long because they bung up the chat line, and try and do them in English if you can, but they can be interpreted. So we can make this more of a conversation rather than just the three of us talking to about 80 people out there. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand whether our systems and our politics are resilient and visionary and brave enough for what we face, which means we've got to identify what we do face now. And you may want to disagree with me, but Roland, it's nice to see you again. And Sir Richard, nice to meet you again. I haven't met you for many years. And of course, in your previous existence, the SIS, MI6, you weren't able to really talk to someone like me. So it's a joy to be able to invite you onto this panel. Thanks to Ulrich. Could I ask you both to give your reflections literally in no more than 3 or 4 minutes, just to get the ball rolling, your headline belief of whether the systems are resilient enough, whether politics is being brave enough. Because I have to say, at the Königswinter conference in London last week, there was a very senior German figure, and it was strictly off the record, but I think it's worth saying that given the enormity of what we face existentially over the climate crisis, it's time when there need to be occasional political suicides by politicians to be brave enough to address the challenges that we do now face, particularly on the climate emergency. So literally, Roland first, 3 to 4 minutes maximum on whether you agree with this contention or you're comfortable that actually the way we are going and the systems we have in place are brave and resilient enough. And please, if you've got a question or a thought, just put it on the chat line as well, if you're not, Roland and Sir Richard. Roland. You're mute at the moment, Roland.
I tried to do it myself, so now you can hear me?
There, we can hear you well.
Okay, so thank you, Nick, and good to see you again, indeed. Maybe, well, a difficult item for 3 or 4 minutes, clearly to say. We are in a very difficult situation, definitely. I would say the situation is slightly better than it was a year ago, because we have on the United States level a more rational chance to debate issues and to come to agreements. And the fact that you cited from the G7 and the NATO press releases and commitments is a signal out of that we have a better understanding about the challenges. This is not a solution, but it is the necessary platform to discuss. The climate change issue has developed on the seriousity of political decision-making to a new level. For us in Germany, very clear by a decision of our constitutional court to make the fighting against climate change to a constitutional issue where the government has the obligation to act faster and in the view of the constitutional court more with direct action than before. And definitely that shows for us in this small biosphere of Germany, but that's for the whole world, that the threats to politicians to communicate the necessary changes out of that are much more serious than they were seen before. What does that mean? That means that in democracies with an independent juridical system, where people can, by democratic decision or maybe also being compliant to international agreements the government signed, you have to initiate activities which are really change the life of the citizens of these countries. Maybe this is on a small level in behavior, maybe that is in changing the income structure of individuals, maybe it's changing the financing and budgeting structure of nations. Some of them may be able to do that, some of them are overstressed also actually. So indeed, it is a big challenge. Can politics handle that in democratic societies? I think yes, but that will cause trouble. And that maybe also be a time where governments were changing when they are not able to translate that smoothly and strict enough at the same time. I see that what President Biden actually is doing as an attempt to do that in a way to stabilize democracy, to deliver, to achieve such goals, and to keep the citizenship as much as possible together to support these democratic structures. In 3 to 4 minutes, I think we have to see that the solution depends on an international operation, which is not an operation of the democratic countries. The interaction of Germany, for example, is contributing 2% to the CO2 issue worldwide, though they have a significant role, but they cannot solve the problem. And the question is, how do we interact in this situation with democratic entities and more authoritarian entities in the world, to combine that in a way that it is again digestible also for democracies. When people in Germany realize that nobody in the world is doing things like the Germans do because they are forced to do them, they become more aggressive against their government and not more supportive because the government is the only one in the world.
All right, Roland, well, can we pause at that point? The big takeaway, it's a big challenge. Can politics handle this? Yes, but. So let's pick up on that. Can I just hear what Sir Richard is, what your view is, Richard, about the state and the challenge, and whether the system is flexible and nimble enough?
The challenge is large scale, and our systems are in a process of fundamental mutation. This has usually been caused by warfare and the consequences of warfare and conflict. This time, we don't have that, as it were, simple answer to why our politics, why social issues, why technological issues are changing at such speed. And then on top of it, we have the pandemic. I agree with Roland that I think democratic institutions do have the capability to solve these problems, not without intermittent crises on the way to doing it. I mean, I don't share, Nick, your sort of messianic view, particularly in relation to climate change. It is wise for us to act fast on climate change. I think we have more time than the doommongers are saying. There are so many variables that we still do not understand that we, as it were, cannot be quite so assertive as you were being about this crisis. But the sensible line for us to take is to act as fast as our capability can take us to a solution, which is to control the rise in global temperatures. But bear in mind, you know, there have been massive variations in the past in global temperatures with consequences that have been, you know, it's not the first time, it's the first time it's happened within, let's say, human experience, but it's not the first time that this has happened. And we don't fully understand all the aspects of this. So that's the point I would make. And I don't think we should also confuse the seriousness of the contemporary crises that we face, the sort of contest, let's say, between ourselves and China, the disintegration of the international security system that we're all familiar with, the rise of Trumpian politics. These are issues which will, in my view, be resolved over time. And how they turn out, it's not entirely clear. I mean, I think, you know, in my older age, I'm getting quite crusty about following the herd. You know, I didn't believe, and I still don't believe, some of the Chinese narrative about the pandemic, for example. I took a very early position on Brexit because I felt that the EU was running out of its political life and that the UK in particular needed a different orientation. Trump's changes were not Trump. They are symptomatic of something more profound in American policy. And, you know, bear in mind that Biden's foreign policy has changed in style, but in content, how much has it changed? It certainly hasn't changed on China. It probably hasn't changed much on Russia. It might have changed a bit on Iran, but we don't know that yet. So I think one needs to be quite cautious about making these big scale judgments and what our solutions to them are going to be. The previous discussion, much to my delight, emphasized pragmatism. We're going to have to take this step by step. And it's quite clear at the moment that some of our political institutions, and I count my own country in this, the UK, you know, are not well adapted at the moment to handling these crises. We have got such internal problems. And for example, you know, someone made the comment previously about Brussels. Brussels doesn't do geopolitics. It doesn't have a strategic brain. So, you know, how is the EU going to react to some of these problems? Probably rather badly in its current format, which is why I come back to the primary national governments in Europe. And I'm talking, I don't want to cause offense to anybody, but UK, Germany and France have a very important role to play in looking at this complex global situation.
Thank you very much. I should say, you use the word messianic. I don't see that at all. I'm merely reflecting the kind of things that have been said.
Okay. Oh.
So don't see this as something particularly personal. I'm reflecting on the latest state of geopolitics on this, whether it be John Kerry from the United States, whether it be Alok Sharma for COP26, whether it be Fatih Birol from the International Energy Agency.
Yeah, but I think some of them are very, very alarmist in the way that they're presenting these issues. And I don't think it's constructive, and I don't think it's sensible politically to be alarmist.
Well, all right. Well, that's an important principle to adopt. Let's therefore pick up on what Roland said from both of you. And I've already got one or two comments coming through. Some of them are quite long, and I've got to read them yet. But particularly about politics and how they can handle it. Roland, can you pick up on that? Richard is saying very clearly that ultimately that maybe it's over dramatic at the moment. What's your view about whether politics, and obviously this will be tested in September here in Germany, what's your view about whether politics is resilient enough, which means actually the human beings, the politicians themselves, whether they are resilient, robust, visionary enough to be able to actually maintain the system in good order, but also move the system forward to cope with the uncertainties of what is happening?
Well, Nick, we too know from our discussions, I'm the optimistic guy, and you are more raising the reasons to be pessimistic.
Realistic.
I'm still on that path. And I think compared a bit with business or my business experience, what do you do when you are in entering an entity in real difficulties? I think there are always three big things you have to do. And the first one is stop bleeding. The second one is reduce complexity. And the third one is concentrate to your strengths. So, and it's not so really difficult when you would talk about the political life. And stop bleeding indeed is that we had not an accurate interaction at the moment, and there I think the U.S. new government, even if I totally agree with Sir Richard that the principal political issues, which are based very much in the democratic electorate of the United States, did not really change. But when you are in a world where you disagree, the question is how you start to discuss disagreement and to manage it. And I think the US government is back to be able to manage the gap of interest or of perspectives to China or to Europe or whatever. The second part is how can we discuss it on a more respected way between the countries. And there I think the problem is we are too much who are important in the world, to be a bit more general. No? We have too many entities which have influence. Historically, we had the Fed to manage the currency issues. After that, we had the Fed and the European Central Bank, and now it's definitely we have China. So that's manageable. But when you look into security issues, you have a special role in Russia, you have a special role in China, you have the problems in the Arab world, you have the difficulties still with the Russian impact to that, and no places to discuss. So I think, in my sense, we need to organize in groups which cannot have a consent in the world, which are large enough, mighty enough, and sensible enough to discuss with each other the rules and the outcomes in that issues. And then we talk about cyber, we talk about climate, we talk about military changes or challenges in that, to agree about that. And there, stabilization of NATO was very important. I think it's more stabilized than 2 years ago. I think we have to do much more on the European Union level. So I pretty much agree that our majority decisions have to be made in more items than now, that the European entity is able to speak with others. We need counterparts in other places of the world to come to agreements in certain issues, where again, climate is one of them. And I think that's basically possible. And when you have that structure, you can explain that also to the nations you are responsible for. It's easier to Mr. Xi Jinping to explain something to the nation because it's just an order. It's more difficult to explain that in the United States, as we experience, and it's also difficult in France or in Germany or in the United Kingdom, as we experience. And therefore, when you want to convince people, it's an emotional issue, it's a rational issue. And the rational issue of that needs to say, well, we have a commitment with others in the world, where when we go along with that, we have a chance at the end to succeed. And then you are with the third part about the strengths. Strengths in economic terms, strengths in military terms, which can be used from different parts. There, the Germans have a quite different role to that what happens in the United States of America. And the Chinese are very much reflecting what is the economic strength of Europe or the military strength of the US. You have to bring that to a new framework. And for me, I think we have to start in Europe. And of course, that's it's a burden for us on the European area that we have to find new formal ways to interact with the British colleagues than we did in the European Union. But pragmatically, it has to be solved. I think it will be solved at the end. But it's slowing down this process of international interaction because the strength of Britain is missing in the Europe context, and the interaction between Britain and Europe is time-consuming and not helpful in that critical situation in which we are.
All right. Well, but again, we're talking, Roland, here about systems being and politics being resilient and brave enough. Resilient and brave enough, and my word put in here, visionary. Richard, can I ask you to respond to that? But let me pick up on what Roger Bass is saying. I'm going to just summarize it here. In an unstable era, a systemic shift is not unlikely. Large-scale solutions addressing big problems could emerge quickly, especially if digitally accelerated. And this could extend even into the geo-economic and geopolitical spheres. And this is the question. To the extent you agree, how should policymakers be scanning the horizon for solutions that have potentially systemic implications? And when you think of your risk assessments that you are involved in, certainly when you were in government, how do you see things as different now, or are they not different?
Well, I think I would be critical of certainly my own government, but other governments' capability to scan very far ahead. I mean, I think it's quite shocking in retrospect, looking back, how the preoccupation with short-term problems often, as it were, reduces the quality of strategic thinking, so that the tactical forces you to react, forces you onto the back foot on an almost daily, weekly, yearly basis. And certainly in the UK, we have really depended on think tanks rather than government to take a more long-term view and to offer solutions. I think the United States is somewhat better. It has, more capability and takes, this scanning more seriously. And it may well be that, with the development of AI, with the development, of big data, the analysis of big data, we do have new opportunities which are as yet unidentified. And we certainly should build the structures to try to harness the benefit of these. I mean, we're discussing one at the moment in the UK, which is, the release of the NHS's data to, come up with long-term health solutions relating more to sort of civil engineering and, institutional health solutions. And of course, big data will help in that way enormously. But I think, these areas of government, although they are quite developed in areas of the private sector, they're still relatively immature governmentally. And obviously there are opportunities there, and I'm not probably expert enough myself to talk about them or suggest that, I have a strategy in my head for exploring them.
Richard, could I just pick up, critical of the ability of governments to scan ahead? And I quoted there the exercise which took place in the UK government. You obviously weren't inside government at that time, but how is it possible to actually have an insight into the probability of where risk is, but actually not act upon it? What is it within government, within these systems, our systems being resilient and brave enough to handle this? In other words, those within government to say, but Prime Minister or Home Secretary, Interior Minister, or Defense Minister or Defense Secretary, you have to understand this is a serious possibility. You need to think about it because it always our country.
You're constrained by resources. Mm-hmm. Anybody who's been through successive, budget rounds, expenditure exercises done on a 3-year basis in the UK will know how even the most ambitious plans and ideas can get slaughtered because the money is not available for the resources to devote to the problem, and the problem may only be hypothetical and may never arise. I mean, this is very, very complex area because it requires significant prioritization, a significant choice as to where you put your effort and where you put your resources. And of course, at the moment in the UK, we're seeing this most dramatically, with the issue of dealing with the pandemic, which has, driven a horse and cart through all government planning for expenditure, and will have done so globally, probably in almost every nation of the world. I mean, this pandemic is the most disruptive event since World War II. And, we're not sure now what the knock-on consequences are going to be. But I'd like to reply a little bit to Roland when he, regretted the UK's departure from Europe. I would actually put my cards clearly on the table and say the UK is supportive of a strong continental alliance. And, the best arrangement looking ahead is an EU with clear strategic and political brain, supported by an independent but very allied United Kingdom. And I think if the reality of Brexit is accepted without further ado, there is a more pragmatic approach to the relationship between the continental powers and the UK. Obviously, the UK's security and future strategically is tied up with what happens. It always has been historically tied up with what happens on continental Europe. And I think that, we have an opportunity to build a new set of strategic alliances which could actually improve European security. And to that extent, for example, I think the UK's contribution to European security should be to focus on building a powerful navy, which in current circumstances, with China building at rapid speed a deep water, a blue water fleet, there is a demand, for international maritime security, which, let's say, could be or is already a UK strong point, although we have allowed our Navy to diminish significantly. I mean, I'm just using that as one example. So I think, with new leadership, maybe in Germany, with new leadership in France, I think there could be a much more pragmatic acceptance of how this relationship could develop in the future. And the one thing I would say is, on defense and security for Europe, not a lot has changed, because the unstated policy of the government that I served for many years, and I think, British governments haven't stood up and said this clearly, was that discreetly we resisted pretty much every EU initiative to build some sort of defense capacity, because we felt it replicated NATO, that it was unnecessary, that it didn't play to any EU strengths. And what have we ended up with in the EU? We've ended up with a list of acronyms that amount to nothing. I mean, Juncker's called PESCO, an European Defence Fund, a sleeping beauty. Well, that's exactly what it is. And there is no Prince Charming to wake it up. The only thing that would fundamentally change European defence is if Germany significantly increased its defence expenditure to 2% and focused on having operationally efficient and useful armed forces. And I would be strongly supportive of that move. Then we would have a different paradigm in Europe. But I mean, the European Defence Fund is insignificant, it's tiny. It amounts to nothing. It's less than half of the current increase in the British defence budget. It's a distraction. And I mean, I could talk about it in more detail.
Richard,
but anyway, I mean, I wanted to be specific in terms of the previous bit of the debate. And this does relate to it quite closely.
What I'm trying to get, what we need to get back onto is our systems and politics being resilient enough resilient and also imaginative enough. Roland, come back in there. Challenge Richard if you want to, but also let's get back to what Richard was saying there about new leadership can change things, and I'm quoting you there. But I'd like to put to you, what kind of leadership are we now about to see emerge? Will a new kind of leadership emerge in this current environment, or is it still very much duty bound to the constraints of political parties? I'm being very simplistic there in order to make a point. Can we get new leadership which is able to equip ourselves for our systems and politics to ensure they are resilient? Roland.
Well, first of all, just to answer to Richard, for me, Brexit is done. So I fully agree with pragmatically approach it. The question is, what is the framework in which we can interact? And there is a specific issue for democracies concerning resilience in that. All people like us who are a bit more involved or interested in politics have a very, I think, acceptable or clear radar screen about that issues we are discussing, which can occur and which will have a worldwide impact. When democratic leaders look to their citizens, whether it's United States, UK, wherever, the agenda is different. As in former times, US President said, it's the economy, stupid. It is still the situation. The fact that Donald Trump was elected was a result of the frustration of the US middle class over 20 years not participating and of the economic growth and productivity increase of globalization. And that's not so different to that what we see in the United Kingdom for the Brexit decision, and that's not so different what we see in France or in Germany in different pictures, or in Italy. What is the real reason for the democratic tensions inside the country? And therefore, the political leaders have a radar screen talking about China, climate, and a lot of things. And the individuals in the society just talking about the question, why do we have that spread of rich people and still underprivileged classes? Maybe added today of racism and other issues which came on the political agenda, which really count for the politicians to be elected. And that is a challenge for resilience. And that, again, my point is that in this environment, political leaders, number one, have to solve that problem at home. Number two, they have to convince people what the international world can contribute to the solution of that problem. And number three, they still have to look at the international problems. And when you have that in mind, I think my thesis is still that can, on a global level, can only be solved when maximum 10 people are sitting around a table, representing large areas of influence. I hope that the British will be on one of the chairs of these 10. I'm not so sure, but maybe you will have enough ships because economically you will not have the necessary size for that. Europeans, in my definition, are the smallest union in the world order who can participate in that, if they can deliver a certain kind of unity and common approach. And last sentence, Richard, there the circle closes, and I think NATO is the dominating security structure for the European continent and for the British and the United States on that Atlantic sphere, and no doubt. But when I see how inefficient the total number of military activities in Europe is compared to that where the US is, so interaction of military sources, and not only concentrating on Germany, I think is a necessary step to be significantly more efficient. We have a productivity of less than 1/3 of that what the United States forces can deliver. That's totally unacceptable, and that's coordination, that bringing forces together. I fully agree with the 2% goal, but my assumption is not that the Germans can carry that alone. Again, the question is who is making the rules of the agenda in the world, which enable also democracies to work in that. For dictators, that's relatively easy. For democracies, it's more difficult. I think it's possible, but it needs a certain framework.
let me pick up on that, and we've got 20 minutes to run, and please, if you've got any comments, please put them on the chat line. I've managed to quote one already, but I'd like to hear more. But what's your view, both Richard and Roland, about the strength of democracy? I'd put to you that even if sometimes democracy doesn't produce the result that you might want personally, actually in the end it has shown itself to be by and large self-correcting, including in Italy, maybe not in Hungary at the moment, but certainly what you saw in the French elections, the regional elections recently, what you saw despite what Trump has said about what happened in the US election, that ultimately democracy is producing a result which by and large is representing the views, whether you like them or not, of the people in a country. Therefore, democracy is not weakened, apart from when it appears to be maybe subverted in the ways that Russia has now been warned about, and Biden obviously warned Putin about. What's your view, Richard, about whether democracy is strong? After all, you were head of a college in Cambridge where you had to uphold certain principles, and one of them is the principles of democratic thinking.
Yes, I have no fundamental worries about the health of democracy personally. I think that all the other forms of government are worse, if plagiarize the quote. Democracy, of course, has its failings and its inconveniences, and I'm sure Xi Jinping loves to tell us how poor it is at solving the problems that confront us. But there's no question that it struggles, but it can come up with the leadership, the answers, and the ability to coordinate and solve complex problems. I mean, why are the Chinese so desperate to close down democracy in Hong Kong? Because they're worried about the virus of democracy being injected backwards into China. I mean, that's the pandemic they fear, is the pandemic of democracy, which of course would make China into a different sort of international partner. Okay, it would still be maybe aggressive and nationalistic. I mean, our relationship, with the world's largest democracy, which in the future is going to be very important with India, is quite fundamentally different, because India is a democracy for all of its faults and all of its chaotic nature. But in essence, we can relate to India politically, and we can, deal with India as an entity, and probably in the future as a really important partner, because it is democratic. And I think that this, clash that is playing out between autocracy and democracy is one of the key issues of the time. And of course, the whole problem of technology has made it much more complex, because we generally have used technology to diffuse power away from governments, whereas the Chinese have done exactly the opposite with the same technology and used it to reinforce the authority and control of the individual, very much, in the style of 1984, where every citizen has a file, is controlled, can be surveilled because of the possibilities of applying the technology in a different way.
So you're saying that really our systems and politics are resilient, even if there are twists and turns and bumps on the way?
Yeah, we're in a very bumpy patch at the moment with some quite strange political leaders who we aren't necessarily in sympathy with, although they are electorally attractive. But we have to accept that that is what democracy is serving up with all its faults. But I have no fundamental difficulty with that whatsoever. And I think we are fundamentally much stronger. I think, we are all talking about China as a coming force. Let me just put a point which is relevant to what we're discussing about China. China has got itself into an extremely difficult place internationally by overplaying its hand. The one thing I learned in my career, and I spent an awful lot of time studying communist parties, is that the leadership of communist parties is highly factionalized, and they are extremely brittle. I think there's a very, very fair chance that if China continues down the road that it's on, particularly if the world begins to blame it for the pandemic, you could see serious problems within the Chinese leadership. The idea that China's progress is a steady upward graph of power and political solidity acting together is ridiculous. It's not going to happen like that.
Let me pick up on that, but via Roland, if I may. Do you think, Roland, particularly after your time in politics, that actually the systems are robust enough, not necessarily resilient, but robust enough to see off what we can call the Russian and the Chinese threat to actually subvert, according to a political agenda, a very tough political agenda? I mean, obviously, we're picking up about what Biden warned Putin about in Geneva last week. But the fact is that ultimately the election still went ahead and still produced a significant result in the United States. But there's clearly a lot of dirty trickery at work here, which could threaten democracy. Or is democracy, the democratic systems that we have, the democratic machinery that we have, are they strong enough to resist it, despite what Russia and China believe is their right to actually subvert?
I think the answer is yes. I think me or whoever, underestimated the problem. After the dreams of Fukuyama in 1989, we didn't care for that any longer because we were convinced that freedom and the rule of law will convince everyone, because it's also combined with a strong economy in consequence of that. Now we see that even without freedom and the rule of law, you can create a certain kind of strong economy, as it's shown at the moment in China. I fully agree with the assessment of Richard about the future. This is not a steep way out with any risk and any amplitudes for the future, but we will have wealthier people all over the world with higher capacities to do things, silly things, or well-coordinated things in that. I think our structures in the democracies we have built here in Europe, in the United States, or in North America, I mean, we can be pretty sure for our generation that it is very robust.
Is there a danger of being overconfident, though, and missing the threat? Roland, is there any danger of being overconfident and not really seeing the insidious nature of the threat?
Well, to me, I don't agree with that. When you look more in detail to Hungary, for example, there are good chances that is more relaxed in a few years. When you look to the Polish development 2 years ago and what you see now, when you see how the right wing of France had to adjust towards Europe, Mrs. Le Pen now agreeing with the European Union and the Euro. So there is still a significant magnetism of the political middle in the democracy that has enough power to be resilient. And when the people like freedom, they like the economic world. When it's under threat, whether it's from Russia or at the end from China, people will react to that in democracy. So sometimes you need that kind of threat to reassure also democratic countries about their strengths and their necessary to convene for certain issues, to be defensive enough and resilient enough. So I still, as you know, Remy, I know about the critical situation, but I think the situation of our so-called Western democracies, the Washington consensus democracies or whatever, we have a significant level of robustness, even having in mind that we have challenging problems to tackle. And
well, let me pick
problems worldwide and internally in the countries.
Let me pick up again. I heard Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, who's a fluent Mandarin speaker, used to serve as a diplomat, an Australian diplomat in Beijing, but he said very explicitly, and do you agree with this, Richard, that China, the Chinese Communist Party, is now a pure Marxist-Leninist party, and that's the way we now have to understand it. What we thought we were getting rid of in Russia and Eastern Europe 20, 30 years ago has now returned in a very purist form. And let me just read to you what Jörg Dreger has written. How do you see the challenges for Europe, especially France, UK, Germany, due to the usage of organized crime structures, blah, 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 especially Islamic migration doors by foreign leaders like Erdogan, Russia, and others, talking about these threats to undermine the system. You are confident, are you, that even against a purist Marxist-Leninist system, the systems that we pride ourselves on and have survived resiliently up to now will remain resilient or not?
Yes, I think they will. And I mean, I agree with Rudd's assessment of the Chinese Communist Party leadership. We forgot, well, some of us didn't, during a period, that this was a Communist Party with a clear ideological structure. And, you know, for a period of time, we hoped that somehow their economic development would change their politics. Well, it still probably will at some point in the future, but in a fashion rather different from how we had originally maybe assessed it. And I mean, the constant tweaking of our weaknesses by the Erdogans and the Putins of this world, I don't think are something that we have to be neurotic or fundamentally concerned about. We have to react, and we have to, as it were, counter the threats. But the idea that this presents a sort of systemic threat to our future and our politics, I just don't buy. I don't think it does. I think we have the inherent strength to resist. And we must be prepared, you know, for a degree of confrontation if, let us take China and Russia. I mean, it depends on how bad their international behavior is going to get. Has Xi Jinping sort of heeded the warnings that really have been issued to him by the United States and its allies? Does he get that now? I think Putin is a different factor, because, you know, Russia is in post-imperial decline. It's aggressive because it's in a bad place. It's got lousy demographics. It's got a very weak economy. It's got serious internal political problems of its own. It's got resources which it can deploy very subtly and with good strategy and make the best of its position. But I mean, it's got a GDP somewhere between, you know, Italy and Denmark, for God's sake. The idea that somehow, you know, we're going to enter a new Cold War with Russia, it's nonsense.
Are you saying that both of them are really making ideological miscalculations?
I think both are. I think what surprises me about Russia is that it hasn't understood the benefits to Russia of entering a strategic dialogue. Not so much, you know, with the West generally, but with, I mean, it's always had an interesting relationship with Germany. I mean, a more constructive economic relationship with Germany would be hugely beneficial to Russia, and it would massively improve European security if we could entice Russia down that path.
All right. Well, forgive me, Richard. We've got 5 minutes left, and there's a very good picking up of your question about leadership here. I think I'm getting this right from Martina Timmermans. I can't read the whole thing, but I'm going to read the first bit of it. The needed level of audacity in any political or economic decision-making system. This is for both of you, because you've both served with public servants. You are constrained by the permafrost layer of those inside the decision-making system who fear personal loss through change. Roland, what's your view on that? Whether, and this is over negative about public servants, and I don't mean it in that way, that actually they need to be given more freedom and more guarantees that if they think in a different way, that is not a career killer for them. Roland.
I will not totally reject that item. I think one of the reasons why that is also everybody who is in that leadership, I think, is a bit irritated over the last 30 years. To be honest, we all were hoping, also in my political generation, we all were hoping that after 1989, this is starting of a period of cooperation and competition, designing a world in a way that talking with each other without permanently increasing tensions by ideological reasons. There were enough intentions for economic interests and whatever. The end is totally different. China or Russia, they kept their role, and so we have to reestablish the fight for freedom, not only far abroad from our countries. We have to get that spirit in our own countries. We didn't discuss about the strengths of our system for a long time because we took it for self-understanding that it is given. And that reduces all that internal, intrinsic motivations, well, to stabilize the system, because it is given, you have not to fight for it. And I think that's over. That's over in the Western democracies. We will come back to that, whether it's via cyber attacks, whether it's further other ideological things, whether it's the increasing dependency on China with all the results. Look, Volkswagen, our big company, has 40% of the turnover now in China. That is a really critical dependency for a country like Germany. Right. So the people will concentrate on that, and that has to change politics internally. So,
all right. Well, let me pick up that with the Martina Timmermans comment, Richard, for you finally. The level of audacity that's needed. It's not about the system, but audacity, and also the mental preparedness of those within systems to think in different ways. What certainly we in our project have called the real negative of conformity. The conformity which qualifies you for a job in many ways disqualifies you from appreciating the scale of disruption, how you have
it's a clever question and a clever comment. I very much appreciate it. I think that because of the strength of the blame game that exists in our democracies when things go wrong, there is a, as it were, suppression of the culture of risk-taking. And you can see many, many examples of this. And I think that, you know, we do need to, as it were, liberate individuals within the system of government to be courageous and, you know, to think radical thoughts and perhaps to be more tolerant when things go wrong. I mean, the amount of time we spend on monies and inquiries and lawyers when we have, you know, these problems, some of which justifiably have to be looked into closely. I mean, I just wonder, you know, how long the inquiry in the UK is going to take into the pandemic and the handling of the pandemic. And what benefit is that, you know, I mean, my question would be, you know, what benefit is that going to gain us? When it's happened, it'll be over. Okay, there'll be some major questions to be answered, but it will create a generation of government servants who will just want to sit and do the least controversial thing and not be courageous in the future. It'll destroy creativity in government.
Thank you for that, Richard. Ulrich, I'm going to hand back to you now, but I just want to do so with a comment from Sandra Klinkenberg. Again, I can't read the whole thing, it's quite long. Many citizens in the EU and UK and also the US are tired of politics. They harbor great frustration against politics due to a massive loss of trust. This loss of trust must be reversed and changed back into trust. And there's much more about the European Union and the European qualification framework, but that issue of trust, and as so often happens in a discussion like this, the comments from the floor are now coming through. We've got another half an hour of discussion, Ulrich, but I think I need to hand it back to you with my thanks to Sir Richard and also Roland for your contributions as well.
Thank you very much.
And Nick, our thanks to you for a fascinating round and never-ending questions. I'm not going to summarize, I'm not going to wind up. I'm just would like to say a word of thanks at the end Ich möchte mich bei allen ganz herzlich bedanken, die zu der Veranstaltung beigetragen haben. Ich habe es eingangs schon gesagt, es steckt viel Arbeit dahinter und ganz besonders den Teams der beiden Einrichtungen auf der Seite in Bonn und auf der Seite in Cambridge und natürlich Dank an die Staatskanzlei. Wir haben den Level of Ambition gesehen, den Nordrhein-Westfalen hat. Und wir haben zugleich auch das Ausmaß der Probleme, mit denen wir zu tun haben, gesehen. Das beides zusammen bringt mich zu der Einschätzung, dass wir mit unseren Diskussionen noch nicht am Ende sind. Und ich kann nur nochmals wiederholen, was ich am Anfang gesagt habe. Ich würde mich freuen, wenn wir diese Debatten dann auch in einer realen Form hier in Bonn oder in Cambridge fortsetzen können. Nochmals vielen Dank an alle, dass Sie eingeschaltet waren, dass Sie dabei waren, dass Sie mit Ihren Fragen zu unserer Veranstaltung beigetragen haben und alles Gute für alle Teilnehmer und alle, die mit dabei waren. Danke sehr und auf hoffentlich bald in Bonn. Auf Wiedersehen.
Vielen Dank.